Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The first structure appeared on Tuesday, just branches and logs woven together. But the construction was wrong, too precise, too engineered. No human built this. My name is Diego Ramirez. I'm a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park, 10 years on the job. What I found during my patrols last month defies explanation. I discovered the structure during routine trail maintenance, 10 feet tall, conical shape, built from local materials. But the engineering was impossible. Load-bearing calculations that would require advanced mathematics. I photographed everything, standard procedure. The construction method was clear, each piece selected for specific structural properties, each joint precisely weighted, like something had designed it for maximum stability. The base diameter was exactly 12 feet, the height exactly 10 feet, perfect proportions, perfect symmetry. No tools marks, no rope, just raw materials woven together with impossible precision. I reported it to park headquarters. They said they'd send someone to investigate, called it unusual human activity. But I knew better. I'd seen human shelters. This was different. The next day, I found 3 more, same dimensions, same engineering, forming a perfect equilateral triangle with the first structure at the center. The spacing was exact, 50 yards between each point. More photos, more measurements, more documentation. The pattern was expanding, growing, following some kind of plan. That night I heard the construction, heavy objects being moved, branches breaking, methodical work sounds, but too fast, too efficient for human hands. I set up my trail camera, had to document whatever was building these things. The night vision footage showed glimpses, something huge moving between the structures, 8 feet tall at least, working with impossible speed and precision. The third day brought 9 more structures, perfect geometric pattern, each exactly 50 yards from its neighbors, each identical in dimension and engineering. The mathematical precision was beyond human capability. I found the first tracks that morning. Huge footprints, 24 inches long, bipedal, 8-foot stride length, moving between the structures in perfectly straight lines. The pattern started making sense. The structures were nodes, connection points, creating some kind of grid across the landscape. That night, I watched from my truck, the camera recording everything. The construction sounds were constant, moving from point to point, building with superhuman speed and precision. At midnight, something new started, deep resonant sounds, like huge drums beneath the earth, each structure vibrating in sequence, creating complex patterns of sound. I recorded everything, the construction, the sounds, the vibrations, evidence of something impossible at work in my park. The fourth day brought 27 structures, perfect mathematical progression, the grid expanding, the pattern growing more complex. The research team arrived that afternoon, set up equipment, thermal cameras, audio recorders, seismic monitors, created a perimeter around the grid. That night, they caught everything. Clear thermal signatures of something massive moving between structures. Audio recordings of those deep resonant sounds, seismic patterns that shouldn't be possible. They took samples, measured everything, documented it all, but they published nothing officially, just installed permanent monitoring stations and restricted access to the area. The structures kept appearing, each night bringing more, each edition following perfect mathematical progression. The grid expanding according to some alien geometry. The cameras kept recording, catching glimpses of something huge moving with impossible speed. working with materials like they weighed nothing, building with precision beyond human capability. The audio recordings captured more, those deep resonant sounds, complex patterns, almost like communications passing through the earth itself. Then it spread, similar structures appearing in other parts of the park, other rangers reporting identical findings, always the same dimensions, always the same precise engineering. The monitoring expanded, more cameras, more sensors. The data kept coming, thermal signatures of multiple massive entities moving in coordination, audio recordings of complex harmonic patterns, seismic data showing impossible energy transfers between structures. I've studied the evidence for months, the photos, the recordings, the structural analysis. Everything points to something intelligent operating in these forests, something that builds, plans, communicates through mathematics and sound. The structures remain. Over 300 now, perfect geometric grid covering 20 square miles, each one identical, each one part of some vast pattern we can't comprehend. The cameras are still recording, still catching glimpses of huge shapes moving between nodes, still documenting impossible feats of engineering happening in darkness. The audio equipment keeps capturing those deep resonant sounds, complex harmonics passing through the earth, patterns growing more intricate with each passing night. And somewhere in this forest, they keep building, keep expanding their grid, keep sending their signals through stone and soil. I still have all the data, all the evidence, proof of something that shouldn't exist, something that builds with impossible precision, something that communicates through mathematics and vibration. The monitoring stations keep recording, the sensors keep tracking movement, the seismic equipment keeps logging those complex patterns of energy. Every night, new structures appear, new nodes in their growing network, new points in their vast geometric pattern. The engineering remains perfect, the mathematics precise, the purpose unknown. Something walks these forests at night, something that builds with superhuman skill, something that thinks in geometry and speaks through the earth itself. The evidence is clear in my photos, in the recordings, in the seismic data, physical proof of impossible intelligence at work in familiar woods, building, expanding, communicating through their growing grid of structures, waiting to be understood. The first structure still stands, still exactly 10 feet tall, still precisely engineered, still marking the center of something vast and incomprehensible. And somewhere in Mount Rainier National Park, they keep building, keep expanding, keep sending their harmonic messages through stone and soil. The grid grows, the pattern expands, the purpose remains unknown, but the evidence is undeniable. Something walks these forests, something builds with impossible skill, something communicates through mathematics and vibration. We record their work, document their patterns, map their expanding grid, and wait to understand what they're building, what they're saying, what they want. 3 months have passed. I still can't explain what happened in Vale du Pati that evening. I'm a geologist. I deal in facts, in measurable data. What I experienced defies measurement. I was alone in the valley, setting up seismic monitoring equipment. It was my 4th day there. The location was perfect for my research, a remote section of Chapada Diamantina National Park in Brazil with unique geological formations and minimal human interference. The valley walls rose sharp and stark on either side. Dense vegetation covered the lower slopes. A series of caves dotted the western ridge. The sun was setting. I had about 40 minutes of usable light left. My final task was to set up the last seismometer and verify the data link to my laptop. The equipment was spread out in a grid pattern, covering roughly 2 square kilometers of the valley floor. I felt the first vibration at 6:42 p.m. The reading was unusual, a steady rhythm that didn't match typical geological activity. I checked the other sensors. They all showed the same pattern. 7 beats, pause, 7 beats, pause, like a massive metronome buried in the earth. The air temperature dropped 5 degrees in 3 minutes. I know this because I was logging environmental data. The thermal sensors graph showed a sharp downward spike. Then came the smell, rotting meat and wet soil, strong enough to make my eyes water. I've smelled decomposition before during field work. This was different, more intense, wrong. I started the audio recording equipment. Standard procedure when detecting seismic anomalies. Sometimes underground water movement or rock shifts create audible frequencies. The directional microphone picked up something at 6:47 p.m. The sound started low, barely audible, a deep thrumming that matched the seismic pattern. Then it changed. The recording captured it clearly. 2 distinct tones overlapping, one at 27 Hz, one at 133 Hz. Impossible for any known animal in the region. I ran it through my acoustic analysis software later. The sound broke the pattern of every biological database I checked. My hands were shaking. I kept working. Scientists document. Scientists measure. I focused on the equipment. The readings grew stronger. The smell got worse. At 6:51 p.m., the first impact tremor hit. Different from the rhythmic pattern. Sharp. Localized. Like something massive hitting the ground. The seismometer closest to the cave entrance registered it clearly. Then another, 30 meters closer to my position. Another, 25 meters closer. Something was moving through the valley. Something heavy enough to register on professional-grade seismic equipment. I switched on my LED work lights. The battery-powered units lit up about 50 meters in each direction. Beyond that, deepening shadows. The sun was almost gone. The impact stopped. The rhythmic vibration continued. 7 beats. Pause. 7 beats. Pause. My satellite phone had no signal. The radio picked up only static. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees. At 6:55 p.m., I heard it. Not through the equipment. With my ears. A sound like 2 massive stones grinding together, coming from the direction of the cave. Then silence. I packed essential equipment into my backpack. Laptop, hard drives, main sensor unit. Left the rest. I could retrieve it later. The grinding sound came again, closer. I zipped up the backpack. Movement caught my eye. Something dark shifted between 2 trees at the edge of my light's range. Tall, broader than the tree trunks. The degrading light made details impossible. I grabbed my camera, tried to steady my hands. Took 3 photos in quick succession. The autofocus struggled in the low light. The images came out blurry except for the trees. The smell was overwhelming now. My eyes streamed. My throat burned. The seismic pattern changed. Faster. More intense. No more pauses between sequences. I saw the first footprint at 7:02 p.m. The work lights caught it clearly. A deep impression in the soft soil. Humanoid, but wrong. 45 centimeters long. The stride length between it and the next print was 2.1 meters. I know because I measured them later. The ground vibration peaked. My equipment displays maxed out. Red warning indicators flashed across the laptop screen. System overload. Another impact tremor. 15 meters from my position. The sound of branches breaking. Heavy breathing. Not human breathing. Too deep, too loud. I ran, left most of the equipment, kept the backpack with the hard drives and main sensor unit. I had a headlamp. I switched it on, pointed myself toward the valley exit. 2 kilometers to my base camp. The thing moved parallel to me, just outside my headlamp's beam. Massive dark shape keeping pace through the trees. No sound now except my breathing and footsteps. The silence felt solid. I reached the first ridge marker, checked behind me. 2 glowing points reflected my headlamp's light, set high above the ground. Too high. They vanished when I focused on them. The smell followed me. The air temperature stayed low. My breath came out in visible puffs. It was a warm evening everywhere else in the valley. I heard something else running. Small animals, many of them, all moving in the same direction, away from the dark shape pacing me through the trees. My headlamp flickered. I had changed the batteries that morning. It flickered again, went out for 2 seconds, came back on. In those 2 seconds of darkness, I heard it clearly. Heavy footsteps, plant matter crushing under massive weight, a deep, rattling inhalation. Close, very close. The light held. I ran faster. My lungs burned. Sweat froze on my skin despite the exertion. The temperature kept dropping. I saw my base camp lights through the trees, 200 meters ahead. The shape pacing me peeled away, moved back toward the valley center. The smell lingered for another 45 seconds, then vanished. The temperature rose 10 degrees in under a minute. I reached the camp at 7:24 p.m., called emergency services, reported equipment theft to avoid explaining what really made me abandon the gear, spent the night in my locked vehicle, returned at dawn with 2 park rangers, found the equipment scattered, not damaged, just strewn across the ground, recovered most of it. The footprints were still there, clear in the morning light. The rangers took photos, measurements, filed a report. They found more prints leading to the cave entrance, massive, evenly spaced, perfect bilateral symmetry. The track disappeared into the cave. The rangers went in a few meters, found deep claw marks on the walls. Fresh. They matched no known species. The marks formed regular patterns, almost geometric. The rangers took more photos, more measurements. I packed up my camp that morning. The hard drives contained all the data, seismic readings, audio recordings, temperature logs, everything that happened between 6:42 p.m. and 7:24 p.m. I've analyzed it for 3 months, ran every test I know, compared it to every database available. Nothing matches. The seismic pattern appears in no geological record. The audio frequencies match no known creature. The footprints fit no living species. The cave marks remain unexplained. The rangers installed cameras, motion sensors. Nothing triggered them. But every month, like clockwork, new marks appear deeper in the cave, following the same geometric pattern, moving further into the darkness. I won't go back to Vale du Pati. My research continues elsewhere. But sometimes, when I'm processing seismic data late at night, I hear it. 7 beats. Pause. 7 beats. Pause. A rhythm in the earth that shouldn't exist. A pattern that waits in the dark. I had been on the job for a couple of years. Nothing too crazy, nothing like the stories you read on the internet. Just a regular forest ranger, doing the rounds, making sure people were safe and the park was kept clean. People loved the idea of danger out in the wilderness, but most of my shifts were just long hours of quiet, fresh air, and a lot of paperwork. It was a Thursday night, a bit after sunset. My shift had started late, covering for another ranger who had called in sick. The day had been uneventful, which was just the way I liked it. Now I was in my truck, driving down one of the back roads of the park. The sky was a deep blue fading to black. The only sounds were the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. There wasn't much light left, but that was normal. My headlights illuminated the road in front of me, a tunnel of trees, thick and dark on either side. The only thing I could see beyond the headlights was darkness. No stars, no moon yet. I knew this road well. I could drive it with my eyes closed if I had to. It was quiet, just as it should be. About halfway down the road, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement. It was fast, a blur. I thought it might have been a deer at first. They were common out here, always darting across the road when you least expected. But something didn't seem right about it. It was taller, almost like a person. I slowed down, squinting out into the woods. Nothing, just the darkness. I shook my head, told myself I was tired. Then, there it was again. Something in the periphery, right on the edge of the light. This time I stopped the truck entirely, foot on the brake, hands gripping the steering wheel. I waited, just watched. My breath was steady, but there was a tightness in my chest. I scanned the trees, moving the truck's spotlight around. The beam cut through the forest, throwing long shadows across the trees. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall, standing still by the side of the road. My stomach dropped. My first thought was that it was a person, maybe someone who got lost. But it didn't move like a person. It was still, just standing, staring at me. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing like the eyes of an animal, almost too bright, like mirrors catching sunlight. My heart thudded once, then again, harder this time. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, that I was making it out to be something it wasn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too big, too tall. I reached over for the radio. My fingers brushed the mic, but I didn't pick it up. What would I even say? I took a deep breath. Just go check it out, I thought. I had a flashlight in the passenger seat, and my sidearm was in the holster at my hip. I didn't want to get out of the truck, but I had to. It was my job, after all. People depended on us to make sure the park was safe. I turned off the engine, but left the headlights on. The forest was dead quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I stepped out, the crunch of my boots on the gravel breaking the stillness. The figure hadn't moved. I could see it now, clearer than before, standing just at the edge of the tree line. "Hey!" I called out, my voice louder than I expected in the silence. Nothing, no response. It was facing me, I could tell that much, but it didn't react. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I lifted the flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it towards the figure. My breath caught in my chest. The light hit it square on, and it didn't move, didn't flinch. It was covered in dark fur, matted, almost like it was wet. Tall, easily 7, maybe 8 feet. The head was large, but the face was wrong. It was too long, the eyes too far apart, and they gleamed in the light, just staring at me. I could hear my heart now, thudding in my ears. I had no idea what I was looking at. My hand instinctively went to my sidearm, but I didn't draw it. Shooting at something, especially something I didn't understand, wasn't the right move. Not yet, anyway. The thing finally moved. Its head tilted slightly to the side, as if it was trying to understand me, or maybe just see me better. My breath hitched, and I felt the muscles in my legs tense. It took a step, one long, slow stride, closer to the road, and my brain screamed at me to get back in the truck. I turned and did just that. My hands fumbled for the door handle, and I almost dropped the flashlight in my haste. I pulled the door open, jumped in, and slammed it shut behind me. My heart was pounding now, adrenaline making my limbs feel shaky. I jammed the key in the ignition, twisting it, and the engine roared to life. I glanced up, headlights still pointed at the creature. It stood there, just at the edge of the road, watching. No aggression, no sudden movement, just that unsettling stillness, the eyes reflecting back at me. I put the truck in gear and slowly began to drive forward, away from it. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the rearview mirror. The creature stood there, unmoving, until the darkness swallowed it again. For a while, I just drove. I didn't look back, didn't slow down. My mind raced, replaying what I had seen over and over, trying to make sense of it. I thought about calling it in, about telling my supervisor, but what would I even say? I saw something in the woods, something tall, covered in fur, with glowing eyes. It sounded ridiculous even in my head. I drove until I reached the ranger station, my hands still gripping the wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. The place was empty, as I expected at this hour. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, engine off, staring at the dashboard. My hands were trembling. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes, staring at me, not animal, not quite human. I got out of the truck, slamming the door a bit harder than I intended. The night air was cool, but I was sweating. I made my way to the small office, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The familiar smell of old coffee and paper hit me, grounding me a little. I flicked on the light, the fluorescent bulbs humming to life, washing everything in a cold, artificial glow. I sat down at the desk, staring at the radio. I could call someone, tell them what happened, but the words wouldn't come. I grabbed a notepad instead, scrawling down everything I could remember, every detail. The height, the fur, the eyes, the way it moved, the stillness. I filled a couple of pages before I put the pen down, my fingers cramping. I leaned back in the chair, staring at what I had written. It didn't make it any clearer. If anything, seeing it all laid out like that made it seem even stranger, less real. I rubbed my face with both hands, trying to steady my breathing. A knock on the door made me jump, my heart lurching into my throat. I turned, eyes wide. The window in the door was small, but I could see a shape there, someone standing just outside. I swallowed, standing up, my knees feeling weak. I opened the door, and there stood Jackson, another ranger, his face drawn in a frown. He looked at me, then at the notepad on the desk. "You all right, Matt?" he asked, his voice low. There was concern in his eyes, and I realized how I must have looked. Sweaty, pale, my hands still shaking slightly. I forced a smile, nodded. "Yeah, just thought I saw something out on Ridge Road," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "Something?" "Yeah, I don't know. Big. Could have been a bear, maybe." The lie tasted bitter, but what else could I say? He nodded slowly, his eyes still on me. "You want me to go check it out?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes, to send him out there and have someone else see what I saw, prove that I wasn't losing my mind. But the other part, the stronger part, didn't want anyone else near that thing, whatever it was. "No, it's fine. Probably long gone by now," I said, forcing another smile. "I think I'm just tired." Jackson studied me for a moment, then nodded again. "All right. But if you see anything else, let me know, okay?" "Yeah, will do." He gave me one last look before turning and walking away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, closing my eyes. I took a deep breath, then another. I needed to calm down, needed to think. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe I had imagined the eyes, the height. Maybe I was just tired, like I'd said. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I stayed at the station for a few more hours, finishing my shift. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the building, every rustle of wind outside made my skin crawl. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. Eventually, my shift ended. I grabbed my things, locked up the station, and headed out to my truck. The sun was just starting to rise, the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. I felt a small sense of relief at the sight, like maybe whatever I'd seen couldn't follow me in the daylight. I drove home, the roads empty, the park still and quiet in the early morning light. I tried to put it out of my mind, to convince myself that it was over, that it was just one weird night in a job that was usually predictable. But that image stayed with me. The eyes, the stillness, the way it moved. It wasn't something I could explain away, no matter how hard I tried. A few days later I was back on shift, driving the same road. I found myself slowing down as I approached the spot where I had seen it, my eyes scanning the tree line. There was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, the silence. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe it really had been just a one-time thing, a strange encounter that would never happen again. I hoped so. But even now, Every time I drive that road, every time the sun dips below the horizon and the shadows grow long, I feel that tightness in my chest. I find myself glancing into the trees, searching for movement, for a flicker of light, for a figure standing still, watching, and I can't help but wonder if one day I'll see it again. I checked my GPS again. 6 miles into the Ho River Trail at Olympic National Park. 6 miles since I'd first noticed the footsteps behind me. 6 miles of being followed. My name is Mikhail Petrov. I'm an experienced solo hiker from Seattle. I've done this trail a dozen times, but nothing like this has ever happened before. It started at the trailhead parking lot. I was adjusting my pack when I heard something moving in the undergrowth. Heavy steps, breaking twigs. I looked, but saw nothing through the dense forest. The steps started again when I hit the trail, always behind me, always maintaining the same distance. When I stopped, they stopped. When I walked, they walked. I tried to spot whatever was following me. The trail winds through old-growth forest, massive trees, thick underbrush, lots of places to hide. Every time I turned around, the footsteps would stop, just silence and empty trail. The footsteps were wrong, too heavy for a person, too regular for a bear. The spacing was off, like something with a very long stride, and they were quiet for their weight, just the snap of twigs and the soft impact of something heavy. I picked up my pace. The footsteps matched it exactly. I slowed down. They slowed too. Always the same distance, always hidden. My heart was pounding. Sweat ran down my back despite the cool air. I'd done enough hiking to know this wasn't normal animal behavior. Nothing follows like this. Nothing this deliberate. After 3 miles, I stopped to rest. The footsteps stopped too. I could hear breathing, deep, slow breaths from somewhere in the forest. Not close, but not far either. Just watching, waiting. I took out my satellite phone. No signal. Of course, the trees were too dense. I was alone. The breathing continued, in, out, like something with massive lungs. Sometimes a soft grunt or click would follow the exhale, sounds I'd never heard any animal make. I ate a power bar with shaking hands, drank some water. The whole time, the breathing continued, patient, steady. When I started walking again, the footsteps resumed. Around mile 4, I found the first tree. Huge claw marks scored the trunk, fresh sap still oozing. The marks started at 8 feet up and raked downward. 5 parallel grooves, each an inch deep. The spacing between them was wider than my outstretched hand. I took pictures with my phone. Evidence. Proof. My hands were shaking so bad, some came out blurry. 100 yards later, another marked tree. Same pattern, same height, same massive spread. They continued along the trail. Every 100 yards or so, another tree. All on my right side, all facing the trail. The footsteps kept pace behind me. The breathing was louder now. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide its presence anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. I reached a clearing around mile 5. Open ground, maybe 50 yards across. I stopped at the edge, listening. The footsteps stopped too. The breathing was clear now, coming from the tree line directly behind me. I turned slowly. Nothing visible in the shadows between the trees, but the breathing continued, deep, steady, watching. I crossed the clearing at a run. The footsteps behind me speed up, matching my pace exactly. Not running, just long, fast strides. The breathing never changed rhythm. On the other side of the clearing, I found my campsite from previous trips. A small flat area near the river, sheltered by big trees. I needed to stop. My legs were shaking, my chest was tight. I set up my tent with trembling hands. The footsteps had stopped at the edge of the campsite. The breathing was still there, moving slowly around the perimeter. Testing, probing. Night fell. I sat in my tent, clutching my knife. The only other weapon I had was bear spray. Fat lot of good that would do against something that could mark trees 8 feet up. The breathing circled my tent all night, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, but always there, always watching. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Around midnight, I heard it clearly, bipedal footsteps, heavy, deliberate, walking upright around my tent. The stride length had to be at least 4 feet. No animal I knew walked like that. At 2 a.m., something touched the tent, a gentle press against the fabric, high up, like something very tall was leaning over, testing the structure. I sat perfectly still, barely breathing. The touch moved down the side of the tent, slow, deliberate. I could hear whatever it was breathing right outside the thin nylon wall. Deep, powerful breaths. Then a soft click or chirp, like the sound from earlier, but closer now, much closer. This continued for hours. Touch, breathe, click, move, over and over, testing every inch of the tent. Never aggressive, just curious, methodical. Just before dawn, it stopped. Heavy footsteps moved away into the forest. The breathing faded. For the first time in hours, I moved. When the sun rose, I found the tracks. Huge footprints in the soft ground around my tent, 16 inches long at least. A clear bipedal gait pattern. The stride length was over 4 feet, just as I'd guessed. I took more pictures, laid my knife next to the prints for scale, used a tape measure from my first aid kit to document the size. Evidence. Proof. Something had walked upright around my tent all night. But the trees were worse. Every tree around my campsite had fresh claw marks, all at the same height, 8 feet up, all facing inward. Like something had marked its territory, claimed the space. I packed up fast, left most of my gear, just took water, phone and bear spray, had to get out. The footsteps started again as soon as I hit the trail. Same distance, same pace. But now there was something else. Marking sounds. Every 100 yards or so, I'd hear powerful scratching. It was marking the trees as it followed. I half ran down the trail, 6 miles back to the parking lot. 6 miles of being followed. The footsteps never slowed, never fell behind. Patient, relentless. The final mile was the worst. The marking sounds were closer. The breathing was louder. It was slowly closing the distance. I broke into a full run. Behind me, the footsteps speed up, not running, just long, powerful strides, keeping pace effortlessly. The breathing was right behind me now, deep, steady, untroubled by the chase. I reached the parking lot at full sprint, fumbled my keys, got the car door open. As I started the engine, I looked in the rearview mirror. Something moved at the edge of the tree line, tall, massive shoulders, long arms. Just a shadow in the trees, but wrong, all wrong. It stepped back into the forest and vanished. I drove straight to the ranger station, showed them the pictures, told my story. They took notes, filed reports, called it a possible wildlife encounter, said they'd investigate, but they posted warnings at the trailhead, closed that section of trail for maintenance, added extra patrols. I've been back to Olympic National Park many times, but never that trail, never alone. The pictures are still on my phone, the huge prints, the claw marks, physical evidence of something impossible, proof that something followed me for 12 miles through those ancient woods. Sometimes I look at those pictures late at night, study the tracks, measure the claw marks, try to make sense of what happened. But deep down, I know. Something intelligent stalked me through that forest. Something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human. Something that thinks, plans, tests. The footsteps still echo in my dreams. The breathing, the clicks, the gentle touch on my tent. And somewhere in Olympic National Park, fresh claw marks appear on trees, 8 feet up, 5 parallel grooves, marking territory, waiting for the next hiker to walk that trail alone. The memory card corrupted. Every image except one. I've been a wildlife photographer for 12 years. I've never seen camera equipment fail like that, and I've never seen anything like what I captured in that last photo. I was in Yellowstone that night, setting up for a moonlight shoot. The location was perfect. A clearing near the tree line, elevation giving me a clear view of the valley below. I had my best gear, Canon EOS 1DX Mark III, 600mm telephoto lens, tripod rated for extreme conditions. The temperature was 38 degrees Celsius. No wind, clear sky, full moon. The first sign came at 11:42 p.m. The deer herd I'd been tracking all evening suddenly stopped grazing. 12 animals, all heads up, ears forward, complete stillness. I adjusted my camera settings. ISO 2800, f4, 1/250 shutter speed. The moonlight was bright enough for decent shots. The deer hadn't moved. Their behavior was wrong. I'd photographed deer hundreds of times. They don't freeze like that. Not all at once. A sound carried across the valley. Low frequency. I felt it more than heard it. The deer's ears twitched in unison. Still didn't move. I switched to my night vision monocular. Scanned the tree line where the deer were looking. Nothing at first. Then movement. Something large shifting between the trees. The infrared signature was wrong. Too hot. Too tall. My hands shook as I mounted the telephoto lens. The deer hadn't moved in 4 minutes. Their muscles trembled. I could see it through the lens. Fight or flight response in hold. The thing moved again. Bipedal. That registered first. Upright. Walking on 2 legs. But wrong. All wrong. The proportions made no sense. I estimated the height using the trees as reference. At least 8 feet. Maybe taller. It stepped into a patch of moonlight. I hit the shutter release. Rapid fire. 10 frames per second. The autofocus struggled, hunting back and forth. The thing's head turned, straight at me, half a mile away, and it looked directly at my position. The deer bolted, all at once. Explosion of movement. But they scattered randomly. No coordination, no escape pattern. Blind panic. The viewfinder showed only black shapes. The autofocus still couldn't lock. I switched to manual, adjusted the focus ring. The shape resolved slightly. Canine features, but stretched, distorted. Wrong angles, wrong proportions. Standing upright like a man. It moved, fast, covering ground in impossible strides. I kept shooting. The camera's buffer filled, cleared, filled again. The thing crossed half the valley in seconds. The deer were gone. The forest had gone silent. A sound cut through the quiet. A howl, but not a howl. It started like a wolf's call, then shifted, changed, became something else. Multiple tones layered together. The sound hit me physically, made my chest vibrate. My ears popped. The camera stopped. Screen went black. I pulled the battery, reseated it. Nothing. Dead. Both backup batteries the same. 3 separate batteries, all dead simultaneously. I grabbed my phone. No signal. The screen flickered, went dark. My headlamp died. Everything electronic dead in seconds. The thing was closer, much closer, moving between moonlight and shadow. Its gait was wrong, like watching a wolf's movements projected onto a human frame. Smooth but impossible, breaking basic rules of locomotion. I abandoned the camera gear, grabbed my backpack. The moonlight dimmed, clouds moving in fast. Temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 minutes. My breath came out in white clouds. It howled again, closer. The sound was clearer now. Wolf howl layered with something else, something that sounded like words, but not words. My head hurt trying to process it. I ran, stumbled down the hill toward my truck. The thing paralleled my course, always just at the edge of vision, moving fast but casual, like it could catch me any time. Was playing. The clouds blocked the moon completely, near total darkness. I had a backup flashlight in my pocket. Old school, incandescent bulb. It worked. The beam caught something reflective in the trees. Eyes, red reflective, 8 feet off the ground. The beam showed more, just glimpses. Grey fur, wrong texture, more like wire than hair. Legs too long, joints bent wrong way. Head-shaped canine, but skull structure all wrong. Too angular, too large. It paced me for 10 minutes, always just at the edge of the light. Moving without sound now, no branches breaking, no footsteps, just smooth motion through the trees. I reached the truck, hands shaking so bad I dropped the keys, grabbed them. The thing was 30 yards away, standing still now, fully upright, head cocked at an impossible angle, studying me. The truck started. Electronics worked again. Dashboard lit up. I slammed it into drive. The headlights caught it full on for 2 seconds. 8 feet tall, canine head. But the proportions were wrong. Snout too long, teeth too numerous, eyes too wide apart. Body humanoid but stretched, arms too long, claws like knife blades, fur pattern symmetrical, geometric, not natural. It didn't move as I drove away, just watched. I saw it in the rearview mirror, standing in the road, getting smaller, still watching. I drove straight to the ranger station, reported vandalized camera equipment, couldn't tell them what I really saw. They found my gear the next day, everything intact, but all the memory cards were corrupted, except one photo. The image shows trees in moonlight, dark shape between them, blurred, but you can see the eyes, red reflective, 8 feet off the ground, and behind them, skull structure that makes no sense, angles that shouldn't exist in nature. The rangers found tracks, canine prints but huge, over 20 inches long, walking upright, 8-foot stride length. They took photos, measurements, filed a report. The tracks vanished at the tree line. That was 4 months ago. I still do wildlife photography, but not at night, not anymore. I had the photo enhanced, analyzed. Experts said it was corrupted like the others, just in a different way. But sometimes when I look at it late at night, I see more details. Things that shouldn't be there. Things that can't be there. The deer never returned to that valley. The rangers installed cameras, motion sensors. Nothing triggered them, but they keep finding tracks. Always at night, always walking upright, always 8 feet off the ground. I've heard the howls again. Distant, at night, when I'm in the park. That same impossible sound, wolf howl layered with almost words. I pack up my gear when I hear it, leave immediately. But before I go, I take one photo in the direction of the sound. Just one. The images always corrupt, but sometimes, in the static and digital artifacts, I see those eyes again, red reflective, watching through the lens. The rangers say there are more sightings now, always at night. Always the same description, 8 feet tall, canine but wrong, moving in ways that break natural law. They've closed that section of the park at night, posted warnings about aggressive wildlife. But we both know it's not wildlife. Wildlife doesn't stand 8 feet tall. Wildlife doesn't walk upright. Wildlife doesn't pace you through the dark, playing with you. And wildlife doesn't stare through a camera lens from half a mile away. Its eyes reflecting red in the moonlight. I still have the photo, the only one that survived. I keep it locked away. But sometimes, late at night, I take it out. Look at those eyes in the trees. Try to make sense of the angles behind them, the skull structure that shouldn't exist. I never will make sense of it. Some things aren't meant to be understood. They're just meant to be remembered and feared. I remember the exact moment I realized I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. No loud noises or sudden shocks. It was just that creeping feeling you get deep down when you know someone, or something, is watching you. I'd decided to do a solo hike that weekend. I needed to get away from everything. Work had been insane, my phone wouldn't stop ringing, and my head was just filled with too much noise. the kind of noise that makes it impossible to sleep or even think straight. So I packed my gear, got in my truck, and drove out to one of the less used trailheads. No one knew where I was going, and I liked it that way. No distractions, just me, the trees, and the quiet. The weather was fine, not too cold, just the way I liked it, clear skies and a breeze that made the leaves rustle overhead. I started on the trail sometime late morning. It was one of those trails that not a lot of people used. It wasn't maintained, not like the popular ones, and I had to push through branches and avoid uneven ground. But it was nice, peaceful. After a while, the sounds of the forest drowned out my thoughts. Just the crunch of leaves and twigs under my boots, birds calling, the occasional rustle as a squirrel darted away. I walked for a couple of hours. I had no real destination in mind, just going until I felt like stopping. The sun had moved past its peak, and the light was starting to shift, getting that late afternoon slant. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps. They were faint, barely noticeable, but distinct. The crunching of leaves, the snapping of small twigs. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. It stopped too. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I stood there for a moment, listening hard, but I didn't hear anything else. I figured it must have been an echo, or maybe some animal that had been moving through the brush. A deer, maybe. I shrugged it off and kept walking. But the feeling stayed, the nagging sense that someone was following me. I forced myself to keep going, trying to shake it, but it didn't take long before I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. The pace matched mine. Whenever I took a step, I heard one behind me. Whenever I stopped, it stopped too. I felt a chill creep up my spine, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. My fingers tightened on the straps of my pack. I spun around quickly, trying to catch whatever it was. My eyes scanned the forest behind me. Trees, bushes, shadows. No movement. Nothing there. I let out a long breath, trying to calm myself. I was being paranoid, I thought. Just nerves, my mind playing tricks on me. Still, my heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept moving, but I picked up my pace. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to seem like I was scared, even though I could feel the adrenaline starting to pump through my veins. But I walked faster, my eyes scanning the path ahead, ears straining for any noise behind me. The footsteps started again, faster now, like they were trying to keep up. My chest tightened, and my breath came quicker. I couldn't take it anymore. I spun around again, harder this time, the soles of my boots slipping slightly on the loose dirt. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet of the forest. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the rustle of the wind through the branches. I strained my eyes, searching the trees. I thought I saw something move, a flicker of motion, just behind one of the trunks. My hands clenched into fists. I wasn't imagining it. I knew I wasn't. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If this is some kind of joke, it's not funny. Just come out." Nothing. No sound, no movement. My heart was racing now, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my forehead, despite the cool air. I stood there for a long minute, waiting, but there was nothing. Just silence. I turned back around and kept walking, even faster this time. My steps were loud, deliberate, as if I could drown out the sound of whatever was behind me. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, but I knew, somehow, I just knew, that they were still there. I could feel it. The trail twisted, winding through the trees, and I kept my eyes on the path ahead. The light was starting to fade, the sun slipping lower. I needed to find a place to stop, to set up camp, but the idea of stopping, of staying in one place, made my stomach twist. I rounded a bend, and that's when I saw it. A figure, standing just off the path, maybe 20 yards ahead. My heart jumped into my throat, and I froze. It was tall, taller than me, wearing something dark. I couldn't make out the face. There was too much shadow. But it was standing there, completely still, facing me, watching. I felt a jolt of fear, my body tensing, my instincts screaming at me to turn around and run. But I couldn't move. I just stood there staring back, my hands trembling slightly. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting. "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "What do you want?" No response. No movement. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, and I took a step back, my boots crunching on the leaves. The figure still didn't move. I felt panic rising in my chest, my breathing coming in quick, shallow gasps. I turned, my eyes darting back down the trail, considering my options, and then, just like that, it was gone. I snapped my head back around, but there was nothing there. The spot where it had been standing was empty, just trees and shadows. I blinked, my mind reeling. It didn't make sense. I knew what I had seen. It had been there. I wasn't imagining it. My hands were shaking badly now. I couldn't stay here. I had to move. I turned back towards the trail, my steps unsteady, and started walking again. I forced myself to keep going, one foot in front of the other, my eyes darting from side to side, scanning the trees. I didn't know what I had seen. A person, an animal, something else. The fear was like a tight knot in my chest, my skin tingling, my whole body on high alert. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere with light. The trail was getting harder to see as the light faded. The shadows were long, stretching across the path, and I stumbled more than once, my foot catching on a root or a rock. My breathing was loud in my ears, ragged and uneven. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing. The forest was still, quiet, like it was holding its breath. I tried to listen, tried to hear if there were footsteps behind me, but my own movements were too loud. After what felt like hours, I found a small clearing just off the trail. My legs were shaking, my muscles aching from the tension. I knew I had to stop, had to set up camp before it got completely dark. But every instinct in me was telling me to keep moving, to not stay in one place. I forced myself to take off my pack, my fingers fumbling with the straps. I pulled out my tent, my hands trembling so badly I could barely get it set up. I kept looking around, my eyes darting to every rustle, every movement in the corner of my vision. The clearing felt exposed, too open, but it was the best I could do. Once the tent was up, I crawled inside, zipping it up tight. I sat there in the dark, my back against the fabric, trying to calm my breathing. I could feel every beat of my heart, hard and fast, the adrenaline making my whole body shake. I pulled out my flashlight, flicked it on, and shone it around the tent. The small beam of light did little to make me feel better, but it was something. I sat there for a long time, listening, waiting. Every noise made me jump, my mind imagining that figure, standing just outside, watching. The hours dragged by. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the tent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that there was nothing out there. But I couldn't convince myself. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. My breath caught, and I froze, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. The steps were soft, barely audible, but they were there, moving around me. I didn't dare move. I just sat there, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, listening. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I could hear my own breathing, shaky and uneven. I clenched my teeth, trying to stay quiet. The footsteps circled the tent once, twice, then stopped. The silence was deafening. I strained my ears, listening, waiting for anything, I could feel the tension in my muscles, my whole body coiled tight. Then, suddenly, the side of the tent moved. Something pressed against the fabric just inches from my face. My heart jumped into my throat, and I stifled a gasp, my eyes wide. The outline of a hand, pressing against the tent, sliding slowly down the side. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I just sat there frozen, staring at the shape of the hand, feeling my entire body go cold. It lingered there for a moment, then slowly pulled away. The tent went still. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound, my eyes locked on the spot where the hand had been. But there was nothing. Just silence. Slowly, very slowly, I let out the breath I'd been holding. My whole body was trembling, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the flashlight. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay here, but I was too scared to move. The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there, my back against the tent, waiting for morning, waiting for the first light of dawn to break through the trees. When the sun finally started to rise, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I waited until the clearing was fully lit before I unzipped the tent, my hands still shaking. I stepped outside, the cool morning air hitting my face, and I looked around. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Just the trees, the clearing, the trail beyond. It was like it had never happened, but I knew it had. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my eyes darting around, my nerves still on edge. I didn't want to be here any longer than I had to. As soon as my pack was ready, I set off down the trail, my pace fast, almost a jog. I didn't stop. Not to rest, not to look around. I just kept moving, the fear still gnawing at the back of my mind, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement. I reached the trailhead sometime before noon, my legs aching, my body exhausted. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like there were eyes on me, following me out of the forest. I don't know who or what I saw out there. I don't know what it wanted or why it was following me. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before. Pure, raw, instinctual fear. The kind that stays with you, even after you're safe. The kind that keeps you up at night, replaying every moment, every sound, every shadow. I haven't been back to that trail since, and I don't think I ever will. I saw it first in the photographs, just a blur at first, a dark shape among the trees, but each frame showed more detail. Each shot revealed something that shouldn't be there. My name is Isabella Romano. I'm a wildlife photographer specializing in white-tailed deer in northern Michigan. I've spent 15 years in the field. What I captured on my cameras last month still keeps me up at night. It started normally. I was setting up my blind near a known deer trail. Early October, perfect conditions. Cool, clear morning. Light breeze. I had 6 camera traps set up along the trail and my main DSLR with a 600mm lens. The first few hours were routine. Does moving through around sunrise. Some younger bucks later in the morning. I shot hundreds of frames. Nothing unusual. Then the deer stopped coming. All at once. No gradual tapering off. They just vanished. 1 minute the trail was active. The next it was empty. The forest went quiet. I checked my watch. 11:47 a.m. Too early for the midday lull. Something had spooked them. The silence lasted for 20 minutes. No birds, no squirrels, nothing moving, just empty forest and dead air. I heard it before I saw it, a soft impact on the ground, like very large, careful footsteps, moving slowly through the trees about 100 yards to my left. I swung my camera toward the sound. Through the viewfinder, I saw movement, something dark moving between the trees. The autofocus couldn't lock on. The shape was too indistinct, too shadowy. I shot anyway. Multiple frames. The sound was moving closer. The footsteps were clearer now. Heavy impacts. Bipedal gait. Long stride length. Looking with my naked eye, I could see nothing in the trees. But through the lens, frame after frame showed something moving, something big. My hands were shaking. Sweat dripped into my eyes despite the cool air. But I kept shooting. Documentation, evidence, proof. The footsteps stopped about 50 yards out. I could hear breathing now. Deep, powerful breaths. Whatever it was huge. I focused on the spot where the breathing was coming from. Through the viewfinder, I saw it. Just for a moment. Clear enough for one frame. Tall, 8 feet at least. Massive shoulders, long arms, covered in dark fur. Standing upright, perfectly still, staring directly at my blind. I took the shot. The sound of the shutter was impossibly loud in the silence. The thing moved. Fast. Inhumanly fast. One moment it was standing still, the next it was gone. The impact of its movement shook the smaller trees. I sat perfectly still in my blind. The breathing had moved. It was circling. I could track its movement by the sound. Slow, methodical, testing. My camera traps were triggering, one after another, in sequence. Like something was moving from camera to camera deliberately. Testing angles, testing coverage. This continued for an hour. Movement, trigger, movement, trigger. A perfect circle around my position. Then it changed pattern. The triggers started coming faster. Random order. Multiple cameras at once, like it was testing the gaps, looking for blind spots. I was shaking so hard I could barely hold my camera. My chest was tight, breath coming in short gasps, but I kept shooting, kept documenting. The movement stopped at 1:23 p.m. The forest was still silent. No wildlife had returned. I waited 10 minutes, 20, 30. At exactly 2 p.m., all 6 camera traps triggered simultaneously. Then silence. I waited until 4 p.m. before leaving my blind. The walk to check the cameras was the longest of my life. Every step, every sound made me jump. The first camera was intact but pointed in a new direction, aimed at where my blind had been. The second camera was the same. All 6 had been moved, all pointing at where I had been sitting. I collected the memory cards with trembling hands, packed up my gear. The forest was still dead silent. Back at my cabin, I loaded the photos. Thousands of frames to review. The early shots were normal. Deer, empty trail, normal forest activity. Then they changed. Starting at 11:47 a.m., every frame showed something. Dark shapes in the background. Partial images of something massive moving through the trees. The sequence was clear. It had started far out, slowly moving closer, testing angles, testing cover. The movement patterns matched exactly what I had heard. Frame 1/147 was the clearest, shot through my main camera at 50 yards, the thing standing still, staring at my blind. 8 feet tall at least, bipedal, massive build, dark fur. The proportions were wrong for any known animal. The camera trap photos were worse. They showed its movement, its speed. Frames caught mid-blur as it crossed between cameras. Split-second images of massive limbs, huge hands, powerful muscles. The final sequence, when all 6 cameras triggered at once, showed it from multiple angles, standing upright, arms raised, looking directly into each camera simultaneously, like it was posing, like it wanted to be seen. I sent the photos to a wildlife biologist friend. He called me an hour later, wanted to know where exactly I had been shooting, said he was bringing a team up. They arrived the next day, 4 researchers, lots of equipment. They took samples, set up new cameras, asked endless questions. I showed them the deer trail, the spots where the cameras had been moved, frame 1/147. They spent 2 weeks in the area, put up thermal cameras, audio recorders, motion sensors, collected more samples. The thermal cameras caught something big moving at night. The audio recorders picked up those same heavy footsteps. The motion sensors tracked patterns of movement that nothing known could make. More photos emerged, all showing the same thing, always partially hidden, always testing angles, always watching. The research team published nothing officially, but they installed permanent monitoring equipment in the area, added new warning signs, restricted access. I still have all the photos, all the data. Frame 1047 is still the clearest, still shows something impossible standing in those Michigan woods. I've been back to the area many times. The deer have returned. The forest sounds normal again. But the cameras keep catching glimpses. The motion sensors keep tracking impossible movements. And sometimes, when I'm in my blind at dawn, I hear those footsteps, that deep breathing, feel those eyes watching. Frame 1147 sits on my hard drive. Evidence, proof, a clear image of something that shouldn't exist, something that walks on two legs but isn't human, something that thinks, tests, learns. The cameras are still out there, still triggering at night, still catching glimpses, still documenting something impossible moving through those ancient Michigan forests, watching, waiting, learning, and sometimes, just sometimes, posing for the perfect shot. The scratch marks are still there. 300 meters into Wagapo Cave. I measured them, photographed them, documented everything. 15 years of spelunking, and I've never seen anything like them, or like what made them. I was mapping a new section of the cave system, standard solo exploration. I had top-tier equipment, primary LED headlamp, 2 backups, emergency chemical lights, plus helmet-mounted GoPro. The cave was dry that day, temperature steady at 13 degrees C, humidity 85%, normal conditions for that depth. The first marks appeared at 2:15 p.m. 3 parallel grooves cut into solid limestone, clean edges, 2.8 centimeters deep, 12 centimeters apart, too uniform for natural formation, too deep for human tools. I photographed them, took measurements. Standard procedure. The marks angled upward at 47 degrees, continued for 3.2 meters, stopped abruptly, no sign of hesitation or fading in depth, just clean start, clean stop. My headlamp flickered. First time in 2 years with that model. I switched to backup power. Same flicker. All 3 LED arrays acting up simultaneously. The GoPro's power indicator started blinking. More scratch marks appeared further in. Same pattern. 3 parallel grooves. But now they curved. Followed the cave wall in geometrically perfect spirals. 47-degree angles maintained throughout. Impossible precision. The temperature dropped 2 degrees. My instruments showed it. The humidity spiked to 92%. No water source nearby to explain it. No draft. The air felt thick, heavy. A sound echoed through the passage, like metal on stone, but not quite. Higher pitched, more resonant. It repeated every 3.2 seconds. Perfect timing. I checked my watch, counted the intervals. The LED headlamps died simultaneously. All 3 units, different batteries, different circuits, all dead at once. I cracked a chemical light. Green glow filled the passage, cast strange shadows on the scratch marks. Movement caught my eye. Something pale, fast, crossing the ceiling 15 meters ahead, gone before I could focus on it. But wrong. All wrong. The way it moved, like watching a spider run on fast forward, but bigger, much bigger, more sounds. The metallic clicking grew louder, changed rhythm, now every 1.6 seconds, exactly half the previous interval. I heard something else underneath, like joints popping, but amplified, distorted. The chemical light dimmed. Not possible. Rated for 12 hours, only lit for 10 minutes. I cracked another. The green glow showed more scratch marks, fresh ones, appearing between my observations. 3 parallel grooves, still cutting 2.8 centimeters deep. Something moved on the ceiling again. Closer now. The chemical light caught it for a split second. Long limbs, too many joints, pale flesh like cave limestone, but wrong, proportions impossible, movement liquid but jerky, breaking basic laws of locomotion. My GPS died, radio dead, phone dead. Everything electronic failed simultaneously. The chemical light flickered. Third one in 15 minutes. Not possible. The cave went dark. I heard it moving, fast, circular motion, around me. Ceiling, walls, floor. Continuous motion, no pause between transitions. The sound of joints popping grew louder. The metallic clicks changed rhythm again. Now every 0.8 seconds, halving the previous interval. I fumbled another chemical light. Last one. Green glow showed it. Full view for 2 seconds. Humanoid but wrong. 3 meters tall but thin. Impossibly thin. Limbs too long. Extra joints. Flesh pale as cave chalk. No features. Just smooth skin where face should be. Moving like stop-motion animation. Jerky but fluid. Each motion exactly 0.8 seconds. It clung to the cave wall. Fingers too long. Too many joints. Gripping the limestone like spider legs. The scratch marks formed under its touch. 3 parallel grooves. Perfect precision. Its head turned 180 degrees. Smooth skin rippled where eyes should be. The chemical light died. Total darkness. The clicking stopped. Complete silence. I felt air movement, complex patterns, like something circling me, getting closer, each circuit smaller than the last. I ran, dropped my pack, kept one hand on the cave wall, standard procedure, follow the wall out. But the texture under my fingers changed, scratch marks appearing as I touched the stone. Fresh marks, still warm. The sound of movement behind me, fast, rhythmic. 0.8 second intervals, getting closer. The air pressure changed, my ears popped, the temperature dropped another 5 degrees. Light ahead, the cave entrance. 300 meters felt like 3 kilometers. The movement behind me accelerated. Clicking resumed. 0.4 second intervals now. Complex patterns, almost like language. I reached the entrance. Sunlight. The movement stopped. The clicking stopped. Temperature returned to normal. My equipment came back online. All at once. GPS, phone, radio, full power. No explanation. I reported equipment failure to the cave authority. Couldn't tell them what I really saw. They investigated. Found the scratch marks. Took photos. Measurements. Matched my numbers exactly. 2.8 centimeters deep. 12 centimeters apart. 47-degree angles. They found my pack. 300 meters in. Right where I dropped it. Next to new marks. Fresh ones. Still warm when they found them. Perfect spirals. Mathematical precision. The cave authority installed sensors, motion detectors, cameras. Nothing triggered them, but new marks appear. Every 3 days, exactly 2.8 centimeters deep, exactly 12 centimeters apart, always in perfect spirals. I analyzed the pattern, fed it into geological modeling software. The spirals form larger patterns, complex mathematics, not random, not natural. Building towards something. The scratch marks continue deeper into the cave, following the main passage, growing more complex, more precise. The latest ones show perfect fractals, repeating patterns that shouldn't be possible to carve in stone. I won't go back to Huagapo, can't. But I study the photos, the measurements, the patterns. They're spreading. Other caves in the system show similar marks now, all the same depth. Same spacing, same impossible precision. The cave authority closed that section, posted warnings about unstable rock formations. But we know that's not why. Rock doesn't carve itself in perfect spirals, doesn't form mathematical patterns that grow more complex over time. Sometimes, late at night, I look at the photos, study the patterns, try to understand what they mean, what they're building toward. But I always stop, because sometimes, in the photos, I see something in the shadows, something pale, something thin, something with too many joints and no face, carving equations into stone with impossible precision. The patterns are still growing, still spreading. And somewhere in the dark, 300 meters down, something moves in 0.8-second intervals, writing mathematics in stone with 3 parallel fingers, building toward a conclusion I hope I never live to see. Peter and I thought it was a good idea. A weekend away, far from the city, far from work, far from noise. We found this cabin online, cheap, isolated, and right in the middle of the woods. Just what we were looking for. Something old, something quiet. It sounded perfect. We got there on a Friday afternoon. The drive was long, the road winding and rough, but it felt worth it. The cabin was small, wooden, weathered with time. It had a certain charm, you could say. The trees were thick all around it, and there wasn't another house in sight. No cars, no people, just us. We brought everything we needed: food, drinks, a couple of books, and our camping gear in case we wanted to sleep outside one night. When we got there, Peter jumped out first, stretching his arms and breathing in the fresh air like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "Smell that?" he said, grinning. "That's freedom." I smiled back, unloading our stuff from the car. It was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The air felt heavy, like the forest was watching, holding its breath. I shrugged it off. It was just different from the city. Different was good. We unpacked, set up our things inside. The cabin had 2 rooms, one main room with a small kitchen area and a couch, and a tiny bedroom with a double bed that creaked if you so much as looked at it. It was simple, nothing fancy, but it would do for the weekend. We put our food in the small, outdated fridge and opened a couple of beers. We were here to relax. The first night was fine. We ate, sat on the porch as the sun went down, listened to the wind rustling through the trees. Peter told me stories from work, and we laughed, the sound bouncing off the trees. As darkness settled in, we went inside, closed the door, and locked it. The lock felt flimsy, but it was just the 2 of us. We felt safe enough. We went to bed early. It was the kind of darkness you don't get in the city. No streetlights, no glow from a distant highway. Just blackness. I remember lying there, the bed creaking whenever I moved, staring into the void of the room. The air was still, heavy. I heard Peter's breathing slow as he fell asleep. I tried to relax, but something about the silence made my skin prickle. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. It was the second night when things started to get strange. We had spent the day hiking, exploring the woods around the cabin. We found a creek, skipped stones, sat on a rock for a while just listening to the water. It was quiet, peaceful, everything we wanted. When we got back to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the trees. We were tired, but happy. We cooked a simple dinner on the old stove, and Peter opened another beer. We sat at the small table, eating in the fading light, the window open to let in the evening breeze. I remember it clearly. I remember because it was the last time I felt calm in that cabin. As the sun went down, I noticed something outside. Just as the light was starting to fade, a glint of something on the wall of the cabin. I got up curious and went to the window to get a better look. That's when I saw it. Marks, deep scratches in the wood, running in long, deliberate lines. Not random, not like an animal. They were almost symbols carved into the wood. "Peter," I called, my voice catching a bit. He came over, peering out over my shoulder. "What the hell?" he said, frowning. We both stared at the marks. They were fresh. I could tell by the way the edges still looked rough, like they hadn't had time to weather yet. My stomach tightened. I didn't like it, not one bit. "Must have been some kids or something," Peter said, though his voice sounded unsure. Maybe someone just messing around before we got here." I didn't respond. It didn't feel like a prank. It felt deliberate, like it was meant to mean something, but I didn't know what. We tried to shrug it off. We closed the window, locked it, and settled down in the main room. I could tell Peter was uneasy. He was usually talkative, always had a joke to crack, but he was quiet now. He turned on the small old radio we'd found on a shelf, some music to fill the silence. We didn't say much. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there staring in. But there was nothing, just darkness, just trees. We decided to go to bed early again, hoping that whatever weirdness we felt would fade by morning. We made sure all the windows were closed, the door locked. I went to the bathroom before heading to bed, and when I looked at myself in the small, cracked mirror, I looked tired. More than tired, I looked drained. My eyes were dark, my face pale. Peter was already in bed when I came out. He was lying on his side, staring at the wall. I slid in next to him, the bed creaking loudly. The air was cold, colder than the night before, and I pulled the blanket up to my chin. We lay there in silence. I could hear the wind outside, the branches swaying, scraping lightly against the roof. I tried to focus on my breathing, tried to relax, but my body was tense, my muscles tight. I was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop. And then I heard it. A sound, faint at first, coming from outside. A scraping, a slow, deliberate noise, like something being dragged across wood. My eyes snapped open, my breath catching in my throat. I lay there, listening, every muscle in my body going rigid. The sound continued, steady, rhythmic. I turned my head slightly, glancing at Peter. His eyes were open, wide, staring at me. He'd heard it too. "What is that?" I whispered, barely audible. Peter didn't answer. He just shook his head, his face pale in the dim light. The scraping continued, moving around the cabin, the sound coming from different directions. It felt like it was circling us. My heart was pounding now, hard and fast. I sat up slowly, the bed creaking under my weight. Peter sat up too, his eyes locked on the window. I could see his chest rising and falling, his breath coming quick. We didn't say anything. We just listened. The scraping moved along the wall, then stopped. Silence. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything, any clue as to what was out there. Then, suddenly, a loud bang. Something hit the side of the cabin, hard, the whole wall shuddering. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat, and Peter cursed under his breath. "Stay here," he said, his voice tight. He got up, grabbing the flashlight we'd left on the small table beside the bed. He flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Peter, don't," I said, my voice shaking. But he was already moving towards the door. He unlocked it, slowly, carefully, and pulled it open. The cold night air rushed in, and he stepped outside, the flashlight beam sweeping across the porch. I got up, following him, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I stopped at the doorway, peering out. Peter was standing on the porch, the flashlight moving back and forth, scanning the tree line. "See anything?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He shook his head. "No, nothing." The forest was dark, the trees swaying slightly in the wind. The scraping had stopped. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. Peter turned back towards me, his face tense. "Maybe it was just an animal," he said, though I could hear the doubt in his voice. "A raccoon or something." I didn't believe it, and I could tell he didn't either. But what else could we say? There was nothing there. "Let's just go back inside," I said. "Lock the door. Wait till morning." Peter nodded, stepping back inside. He closed the door, locked it again, and we both stood there for a moment, not speaking. My heart was still pounding, my hands trembling slightly. We went back to the bedroom, but neither of us lay down. We just sat on the edge of the bed, listening, waiting. I kept expecting to hear the scraping again, to hear something else, but it was just silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. After what felt like hours, exhaustion finally started to set in. Peter lay back down, pulling the blanket up, and I did the same. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, my body tense. I didn't think I'd be able to sleep, but eventually my eyes grew heavy and I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. It was still dark. I didn't know what had woken me, but something felt wrong. I looked over at Peter. He was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. I listened, straining my ears. At first there was nothing, just the wind, the creaking of the old cabin, and then I heard it. A soft sound, coming from just outside the bedroom window, a whisper, low, almost inaudible, like someone speaking just under their breath. My blood ran cold. I lay there, frozen, my eyes wide, my breath caught in my throat. The whispering continued, just a soft murmur, like words I couldn't quite make out. It felt like it was right outside, just inches away from where I lay. I turned my head, slowly, my eyes moving to the window. It was dark, nothing but shadows. But I could feel it. Something was there, just beyond the glass. I reached over, shaking Peter's shoulder. He stirred, his eyes blinking open, and I put a finger to my lips, pointing towards the window. He listened, his face going pale as the whispering continued. We didn't move, we didn't speak. We just lay there, listening, the sounds seeping into the room, filling the silence. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The whispering stopped, abruptly, and the silence that followed was almost worse. I held my breath, waiting, every muscle in my body tense. Then suddenly, the window rattled, a loud, sharp noise that made both of us jump. Peter sat up, his eyes wide, and I did the same. The rattling stopped, and there was silence again. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, my voice shaking. Peter nodded, his face set, and we both got up, moving quickly. We grabbed our things, shoving them into our bags without bothering to pack properly. I could feel my hands trembling, my whole body on edge. We didn't bother with the light. We moved through the cabin in the dark, our footsteps soft, trying not to make any noise. Peter grabbed the keys, and we headed for the door. He unlocked it, pulling it open, and we stepped out into the cold night air. The forest was still, the wind gone, everything eerily quiet. We moved quickly, not looking back, heading straight for the car. We got in, slamming the doors shut, and Peter fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The engine roared to life, and he hit the gas, the tires spinning for a moment before finding traction. We drove away, the cabin disappearing into the darkness behind us. Neither of us spoke. My heart was still pounding, my hands clenched in my lap. I kept looking back, half expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing, just darkness. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the cabin long behind us, the road empty and dark. Peter finally pulled over, turning off the engine, and we both sat there, breathing hard. Neither of us said anything for a long time. I could still hear the whispering in my head, the soft murmur that had come from just outside the window. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't want to know. We never went back to that cabin. We never even talked about it again. It was like some unspoken agreement between us. Whatever had been there, whatever had marked the walls and whispered in the dark, we didn't want to understand it. We just wanted to forget. The first dead elk was 40 feet up in a Douglas fir. No animal I knew could do that. No animal could lift a 700-pound carcass that high. But there it was. My name is Chen Wei. I'm a research botanist studying old-growth forests in Oregon. I've spent 20 years in the field. What I documented last summer defied everything I know about wildlife behavior. I found the elk on my third day at the research site. I was collecting moss samples when I noticed the blood drops on the leaves. Looking up, I saw the carcass wedged in the branches. Fresh kill, still warm, broken bones protruding from precisely torn flesh. I took photos, documented the scene, standard procedure. The placement was wrong, the damage pattern was wrong. No known predator kills like this. The forest was quiet, no scavengers, no birds. Even the insects were gone. Just dead silence and that mangled carcass overhead. I called the local wildlife service, reported the find. They said they'd send someone out the next day. I made camp a quarter-mile away, upwind from the kill site. That night, I heard the trees breaking, systematic snaps and crashes moving through the forest, following a pattern, creating a path. The sound started a mile out. Every 2 minutes another tree would break, getting closer. Always the same timing, always the same direction, moving toward my camp. I tracked the pattern on my tablet, plotted each break on the map, a perfect spiral forming, centered on my location. At midnight, the pattern changed. Multiple breaks at once, creating corridors, opening lines of sight, all facing my camp. I sat in my tent, recording times and compass bearings, documentation, evidence. The pattern was too precise to be natural, too deliberate. The break stopped at 3 a.m. The forest was dead silent. Then the footsteps started, heavy impacts, bipedal gait, long stride length, moving along the paths created by the broken trees, checking each corridor, testing angles. I could track the movement, systematic, methodical. Each path examined exactly once, each angle tested. This continued until dawn, then silence. When the sun rose, I checked the area. The destruction was precise. Trees snapped clean off at varying heights, creating perfect sight lines to my camp. The pattern visible from above would show a spiral with 8 spokes, all centered on my tent. I took more photos, measured angles, documented everything. The breaks were too clean for wind damage, too consistent for natural causes. Something had created this pattern deliberately, but the tracks were worse. Huge footprints in the soft ground, 18 inches long, bipedal, stride length over 5 feet, following exact paths along the corridors. I packed up camp, moved 2 miles east, set up trail cameras, had to document whatever was doing this. That night, it started again. The same pattern, breaking trees in a spiral, creating corridors, always centered on my new location. The cameras caught glimpses, something huge moving in the darkness, 8 feet tall at least, massive shoulders, long arms, moving with impossible speed between the trees. Each night, the same thing. New location, new pattern, spiral of broken trees, perfect sight lines, those heavy footsteps testing each corridor. On the 4th night I found the second elk, 40 feet up again, fresh kill, same precise damage pattern. This time I saw how it was placed. Something lifted that 700-pound carcass like it weighed nothing, climbed the tree with it, wedged it into the branches. The whole process took less than a minute. I caught it on camera, just fragments, blurred frames of something massive moving vertically up the trunk, powerful arms placing the carcass, then gone, inhumanly fast. The Wildlife Service finally sent someone. Young officer. He looked at the patterns, the broken trees, the photos. Called in more people. They brought equipment, thermal cameras, audio recorders, motion sensors, set up a perimeter around my research site. The thermal cameras caught it clearly. Huge heat signature, 8 feet tall, moving faster than anything that size should move, creating those precise patterns of destruction. The audio recorders picked up more, vocalizations, deep resonant calls that didn't match any known species, complex patterns, almost like speech. The motion sensors tracked its movements, The speed, the precision, the deliberate testing of angles and approaches. They installed permanent monitoring stations, added patrols, restricted access to the area, but they published nothing officially. I stayed 3 more weeks. Every night the same thing. New patterns of broken trees, new corridors, new elk carcasses placed high in the canopy. The cameras kept recording, the sensors kept tracking. Every night, more evidence of something impossible moving through those ancient woods. Then it escalated. The patterns started appearing around other camps, other researchers, always the same. Spiral of broken trees, perfect sight lines, testing approaches. More elk appeared in the trees. Some bears too, always 40 feet up, always the same precise damage pattern, like it was sending a message. The Wildlife Service expanded their monitoring. More cameras, more sensors, more patrols. The data kept coming. Thermal signatures of something huge moving at impossible speeds. Audio recordings of those complex vocalizations. Motion tracks of deliberate testing patterns. I've studied the data for months. The photos, the recordings, the patterns. Everything points to something intelligent operating in those forests. Something that plans, tests, learns. The monitoring stations are still active, still tracking movement at night, still recording those vocalizations, still documenting patterns of broken trees. More elk appear in the canopy, more bears, always 40 feet up, always precisely placed, like markers, like warnings. The photos are still clear, the thermal images still sharp, the audio still clean. Physical evidence of something impossible stalking those Oregon forests. Something that can break trees like twigs, lift hundreds of pounds effortlessly, move faster than any known animal. Think, plan, test. The patterns continue, new spirals, new corridors, new sight lines, always centered on camps, always testing approaches, and somewhere in those ancient woods, something waits, watches, plans its next pattern. I still have all the data, all the evidence, proof of something that shouldn't exist, something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human, something intelligent, patient, precise. The monitoring stations keep recording, the cameras keep capturing images, the sensors keep tracking movement, and every night new trees break, new patterns form, new messages appear 40 feet up in the canopy, waiting to be found, waiting to be understood, waiting. I found the cabin 6 months ago. It's not on any map of Reserva Nacional Magallanes. I've patrolled this sector for 8 years. I know every structure, every trail, every landmark. But this cabin just appeared, and what I found inside still haunts me. It was a routine patrol. Clear day. 15 degrees C, light wind from the south. I was checking the Eastern Ridge Trail for storm damage. The cabin stood in a small clearing, rough-hewn logs, single window, smoke rising from the chimney. I checked my GPS. Coordinates placed it in a sector I'd patrolled hundreds of times. No cabin had ever been there. The structure looked old, very old. The logs had the weathered patina of century-old wood, but the craftsmanship was perfect. No decay, no damage. I approached the door. Standard procedure for finding unexpected structures. Identify yourself. Check for occupants. Document everything. The wood felt wrong under my knuckles when I knocked. Too dense, too cold. The door swung open on silent hinges. The interior hit me first. Everything perfectly preserved, but wrong, all wrong. The furniture, the decorations, the items scattered around, all from the 1800s, but pristine, like they'd been placed there yesterday. A fire burned in the hearth, fresh wood, active flames. The table held a steaming bowl of stew, steam rising in steady curls. A spoon laid beside it, positioned with mechanical precision, parallel to the bowl's edge, exactly parallel. I took photos, standard procedure. The camera struggled to focus, each shot slightly blurred, like the objects were moving between frames. But everything was still, perfectly still. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 30 seconds. My thermometer showed it. Digital display flickering, numbers dropping steadily, no draft, no open windows, just steady temperature decline. Movement caught my eye. A man stood in the bedroom doorway, tall, thin, wearing clothes from the 1800s. Perfect condition, too perfect, no wear, no wrinkles. He didn't move right, each motion too slow, like watching a video at quarter speed. His face was wrong, features too symmetric, skin too smooth. The eyes didn't track properly, moved in steps instead of smooth motion, like a mechanical doll. "Good evening, señorita," he said. The Spanish was wrong, too old. Pronunciation and grammar from 2 centuries ago. His voice had no echo, no resonance, like the air absorbed the sound. My radio crackled, static, then voices, old Spanish, multiple speakers, having a conversation that made no sense, talking about events from the 1800s like they were happening now. The man took a step forward, wrong movement, too fluid but too slow, like he was walking through thick syrup. His boots made no sound on the wooden floor. The temperature dropped another 5 degrees. "Please, join me for supper," he said. Same tone, same pitch, exact same pronunciation as before, like a recording playing twice. The stew on the table steamed in a perfectly regular pattern, the same curl of vapor repeated every 3.2 seconds. I timed it, counted the intervals. Mathematical precision in random motion. My camera died, radio died, GPS died, phone died. Everything electronic failed simultaneously. The temperature hit 0 degree. My breath fogged in perfect geometric patterns. The man took another step. Same fluid slow motion. His clothes didn't move with him, stayed perfectly still on his frame. His head turned 90 degrees, exactly 90 degrees. I measured the angle later in the photos that survived. "The year is 1847, he said. Same voice, same pitch, but now layered. Multiple identical tracks speaking slightly out of sync. "You should stay. Time moves differently here." The fire's motion changed. Flames frozen in mid-flicker. No heat output. Just light. Wrong light. Too regular. Too patterned. I backed toward the door. The man matched my movement. Same slow, fluid motion. Perfect synchronization. His face never changed expression. The eyes kept moving in mechanical steps. The room's dimensions shifted. Angles changed. Straight lines curved. I measured them later in the photos. Impossible geometry. The interior space grew larger without the exterior changing. The temperature hit 5 degrees. Frost formed on the walls. Perfect crystal patterns, growing in mathematical sequences. I recognized Fibonacci spirals in their formation. The man stood at the table now, no transition, just there. The stew still steamed. Same 3.2-second interval. He lifted the spoon. The motion took 12.8 seconds, exactly 4 steam intervals. "Time is fluid here," he said. The layered voices grew more complex, more out of sync, echo patterns that shouldn't be possible in that space. "The boundaries thin, you see?" The walls rippled, solid log walls moving like water. But wrong. Too regular, too patterned. The ripples formed equations, mathematical formulas from the 1800s, theorems that hadn't been written yet in that time. My hands shook as I reached for the door. The handle felt wrong. Different texture every time my fingers moved, like touching multiple materials simultaneously. The man's face changed, features shifted, cycled through different appearances, all from the 1800s, all too perfect, too symmetrical. The transitions took exactly 3.2 seconds, same as the steam interval. "We exist in the folds," the layered voices said, "between the moments, between the years. You could stay, learn. Time means nothing here." The door opened. Cold air rushed in. Normal cold, natural cold. The man's image flickered, static like a bad TV signal. His edges blurred, shifted, showed different versions of the same person occupying the same space. I ran. Standard procedure abandoned, pure survival instinct. The clearing had changed. Trees grew and died in seconds. Seasons cycled in irregular patterns. Snow fell upward. The man stood in the doorway. Multiple versions overlapped. Dozens of identical figures occupying the same point in space, all moving in that same fluid slow motion, all speaking in layered voices. "Time will fold again," they said in perfect unison. "We will wait. We always wait." I reached the normal forest. Regular time. Regular physics. My equipment came back online. Everything working perfectly. No explanation. I reported a suspicious structure. Couldn't tell them what I really saw. The response team found the cabin, took photos, measurements, but everything was wrong. The interior was empty, abandoned for centuries. No fire, no stew, no man. But the photos showed something else. Images overlapped, multiple time periods captured in single frames. The man appeared in every photo, transparent, different positions, different eras, all occupying the same space. The cabin disappeared 3 days later. Just gone. No trace. But the photos remain. I've analyzed them, studied the patterns, the mathematical principles at work, the geometry of time gone wrong. Sometimes the radio picks up those voices, old Spanish conversations from centuries ago, discussing events that haven't happened yet. The signal always lasts exactly 3.2 seconds. The response team installed sensors, motion detectors, cameras. Nothing triggers them. But every month, like clockwork, a new cabin appears. Different location, different time period. Always empty when investigated. Always gone in 3 days. The photos show more each time. Layers of history occupying the same point in space. And in every image, in the background, that man stands watching. Multiple versions overlapped, all moving in that fluid slow motion, all speaking in layered voices about the folds in time. I still patrol that sector. Have to. It's my job. But I carry a film camera now. No electronics. And when I develop the photos, I study them carefully. Looking for him. For them. For all the versions existing between the moments, between the years. They're still there. In the folds. In the cabin that appears and disappears. In the spaces where time moves wrong. Waiting. Always waiting. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear their layered voices on the radio, speaking in Old Spanish about events yet to come, reminding me that time isn't what we think, that somewhere, in the folds between moments, they're still having that endless supper, still moving in that fluid slow motion, still watching, still waiting. The first time I saw it, I thought it was just a deer. It was early morning, the kind of morning where the sky is a dull grey and there's just enough light to see without a flashlight. I was out on the lake, sitting in my small rowboat, waiting for a bite. The water was still, the air was crisp, and everything was quiet except for the occasional splash of fish or the rustle of the wind in the trees. It was supposed to be peaceful. I had been fishing since dawn, but I wasn't having much luck. I cast my line out again and leaned back, listening to the creak of the boat. That's when I noticed something move on the opposite bank. I glanced up, expecting to see a deer, or maybe a coyote. The lake was bordered by forest on all sides, and I'd seen plenty of wildlife out here before. But this was different. At first, it was just a shape, moving through the underbrush, a flash of brown that caught my eye. I squinted, trying to get a better look. It wasn't a deer. It was standing too tall, moving too smoothly. Whatever it was big, and it was on 2 legs. My gut twisted a bit, an uneasy feeling creeping in. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was just seeing things. But when I looked back, it was still there, closer now, standing at the water's edge. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was definitely not an animal. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and covered in dark, matted hair. Its head was large, too large, and I could see its eyes, reflecting in the dim light, staring straight at me. It was like it was studying me, trying to figure me out. A shiver ran down my spine. My first instinct was to reach for the oars, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. I just sat there staring back, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my hands starting to tremble. I swallowed, trying to keep calm, but something about it, something about the way it just stood there, those eyes, made me feel like I was prey, like it was deciding whether or not to come after me. I finally snapped out of it, my hands fumbling for the oars. I tried to keep my movements slow, not wanting to provoke it, but I could feel the adrenaline surging through me, making my fingers clumsy. I dipped the oars into the water, the boat rocking slightly, the sound loud in the silence. The thing didn't move. It just kept watching me, its head tilting slightly as I started to row, the water splashing against the sides of the boat. My breath was coming faster now, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't take my eyes off it, afraid that if I looked away, it would start moving, that it would be on me before I had a chance to react. I rowed as quickly as I could without making it obvious that I was panicking. The distance between us grew, but I could still see it, standing there at the water's edge, those eyes following me. I rowed until my arms burned, until I was almost at the middle of the lake, the farthest point from any shore. I stopped, breathing hard, my muscles aching. I turned to look back, squinting at the shoreline. It was still there, smaller now because of the distance, but it hadn't moved, just standing, staring. I shivered, a cold sweat running down my back. I stayed out on the water for a while, too scared to go back to the shore. I kept watching it, waiting for it to leave, but it didn't. It just stood there, like it had all the time in the world. Eventually, as the light grew brighter and the sun started to peek through the trees, it turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. I let out a long breath, my body sagging with relief. But the fear didn't go away. Even after it was gone, I felt its presence, like it was still out there, watching, waiting. I didn't want to be on the lake anymore. I rowed back, my eyes darting to every shadow, every rustle of the leaves. When I got to the dock, I tied the boat up quickly, my hands shaking. I grabbed my gear, glancing back at the woods, but there was nothing there, just the trees, the wind, the empty shoreline. I tried to tell myself it was over, that it was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. I packed up my things and left. I didn't want to stay out there alone. As I drove away, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see it standing in the road behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty road, winding back into the forest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. Those eyes, staring at me, that stillness that felt so unnatural. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, that maybe I'd imagined it, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, I decided to go back. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I wanted to face it, to see it in the daylight, to understand what it was. I got to the lake around dawn. The air was cold, the sky overcast, and everything was quiet. I parked my truck and walked down to the dock, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, no sound, no sign of anything unusual. I untied the boat, pushing off from the dock, the oars dipping into the water. My heart was pounding, my stomach tight. I rowed out to the middle of the lake, the same spot I'd been the day before. I stopped, letting the boat drift, and looked back towards the shore. At first, there was nothing. Just the trees, the underbrush, the empty shoreline. I let out a breath, my muscles relaxing slightly. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had just been passing through. But then I saw it. A flash of movement, deeper in the woods. I squinted, my breath catching. It was there, farther back, half hidden by the trees, but I could see it. Those eyes, glinting in the dim light, staring at me. My chest tightened, fear washing over me. It hadn't left. It was still there, still watching. I could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was trying to figure me out, to decide what to do with me. I didn't wait. I grabbed the oars, rowing hard, the boat lurching forward, the water splashing against the sides. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was coming. I just rowed, my muscles burning, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When I reached the dock, I jumped out, pulling the boat up, my hands trembling. I glanced back at the woods, but I couldn't see it anymore. The trees were still, the forest quiet. But I knew it was there, somewhere, watching. I grabbed my gear and headed back to the truck. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. I started the engine, the sound loud in the silence, and drove away, my eyes flicking to the mirrors, my heart pounding. I didn't go back to the lake after that. I couldn't. Just the thought of it made my skin crawl, made my heart race. I didn't want to see it again. I didn't want to feel those eyes on me, that stillness that felt so wrong. But even now, even miles away, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, that it's still watching, waiting. Every time I close my eyes, I see it. Standing at the edge of the water, those eyes glinting in the dark, that sense of something not quite right. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. All I know is that it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there. And it saw me. It knew I was there. And that's what scares me the most. I've thought about telling someone, park rangers, the police, anyone. But what would I even say? That I saw something strange, something that didn't move right, didn't look right. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am. Maybe it was all in my head. But it felt real. Too real. So I keep it to myself. I try to forget, try to push it out of my mind. But some nights, when everything is quiet, I hear the water lapping against the sides of the boat, the rustle of the wind in the trees, and I feel those eyes on me again. And I know it's still out there somewhere watching. The first sound came from the roof at 2:37 a.m., a deliberate impact, testing the structure. I grabbed my rifle and waited. My name is Victor Petrov. I'm a professional hunter with 20 years of experience in the Colorado Rockies. What happened at my cabin last month destroyed everything I thought I knew about wildlife behavior. I was doing paperwork at my desk when I heard it. A heavy footstep on the metal roof, then another, and another, moving with purpose, testing weight distribution. I checked the security cameras on my laptop, nothing visible in the infrared feed, but the impacts continued, systematic, methodical, working from corner to corner. The dogs were silent. 3 trained hunting hounds cowering in the corner, their eyes fixed on the ceiling, following something I couldn't see. At 3 a.m. the pattern changed. The footsteps moved to the walls, heavy impacts testing the structure, starting at the corners, working inward, precise, deliberate. I activated the exterior floodlights. Nothing visible, but the impacts continued, moving around the cabin, testing every joint, every weak point. The temperature dropped. My breath fogged in the air. The impacts grew stronger, more insistent. The whole cabin shook with each hit. I started recording on my phone. Documentation, evidence. The impacts followed a clear pattern, testing structural integrity, looking for ways in. At 4 a.m. something new started. Scraping sounds. Long, slow drags against the wooden walls, like huge claws testing the surface. The pattern matched the footsteps. Systematic. Thorough. I checked the cameras again. Still nothing visible. But the exterior temperature sensors were going crazy, showing impossible cold spots moving around the cabin. The scraping continued until dawn. Then silence. When the sun rose, I found the marks. Deep gouges in the logs. 5 parallel grooves in each set. 8 feet up the walls. The spacing between marks was 14 inches. Larger than any bear. I took photos. Measured everything. The pattern was clear. Every weak point had been tested. Every joint examined. Like something was mapping the structure. That night, it came back. Different pattern. The footsteps started on the ground, circling the cabin, creating trails in the snow, perfect concentric circles. The security cameras caught movement, just glimpses, something huge, moving too fast for clear images. 8 feet tall at least, massive shoulders, long arms. Every hour the circles tightened, moving closer to the walls. The dogs stayed silent, trembling in the corner, following the movement with their eyes. At midnight, the testing began again. Impacts on the walls, scraping sounds. But now there were vocalizations, deep, resonant calls, complex patterns, almost like speech. I recorded everything. The sounds, the movement patterns, the temperature changes, evidence of something impossible circling my cabin. The third night brought hair. Dark, coarse strands caught in the wood where it had scraped. Too thick for bear, too long for elk. I collected samples, documented locations. The fourth night, it changed tactics. No more testing, no more circles. It stood in front of the cabin, just beyond the light, breathing, watching. The security cameras showed a heat signature, huge, bipedal, just standing there, 8 feet tall, massive chest. The thermal reading was wrong, too cold for a living thing. It stood there for hours, breathing, watching, sometimes making those complex vocalizations. I recorded everything. At dawn, it left something, a dead elk, placed with surgical precision exactly 40 feet from my door. No predator marks, no signs of struggle, just carefully positioned. The tracks told the story. Huge footprints, 22 inches long, bipedal, 7-foot stride length, perfect straight line from the tree line to the elk. I called other hunters, showed them the evidence, the marks, the hair, the tracks. They brought in experts. The research team arrived the next day, set up equipment, thermal cameras, audio recorders, motion sensors, created a perimeter around my cabin. That night, it came back. The cameras caught everything, clear thermal signature moving with impossible speed, audio recordings of those complex vocalizations, motion tracks showing deliberate testing patterns. They took samples, measured tracks, documented everything, but they published nothing officially, just installed permanent monitoring stations and restricted access to the area. I stayed in my cabin, kept recording. Every night brought new tests, new patterns, more dead elk placed with geometric precision around the property. The hair samples showed impossible results. DNA that didn't match any known species. Cellular structure that didn't make sense. The research team took everything to a lab. Then others started reporting similar incidents. Other cabins, other hunters. Always the same pattern. Testing structures, leaving marks, placing dead elk in geometric patterns. The monitoring expanded. More cameras, more sensors. The data kept coming. Thermal signatures of something huge moving faster than possible. Audio recordings of complex vocalizations. Motion tracks showing impossible patterns. I've studied the evidence for months. The photos, the recordings, the samples. Everything points to something intelligent operating in these mountains, something that tests, plans, communicates. The monitoring stations are still active, still tracking movement at night, still recording those vocalizations, still documenting new patterns. The marks remain in my cabin walls, the tracks still visible in the hard ground, the hair samples still defying analysis. Physical evidence of something impossible, something that can move faster than any known animal, something that thinks systematically, something that's trying to communicate through death and geometry. And somewhere in these mountains, it waits, watches, plans its next test. I still have all the data, all the evidence, proof of something that shouldn't exist, something that walks on two legs but isn't human, something intelligent, methodical, precise. The cameras keep recording, the sensors keep tracking, the samples keep confounding analysis, and every night new patterns appear, new tests begin, new messages written in dead elk and geometric precision, waiting to be found, waiting to be understood, waiting. The impacts still echo in my dreams, those systematic tests, those careful patterns, the signature of something impossible moving through familiar mountains. And somewhere in Colorado, new cabins are tested, new patterns formed, new messages left in the darkness, written in precise geometry, written in careful depth, written in systematic testing, waiting to be decoded. The vegetation died in a perfect circle, 40 meters in diameter, precise circumference. I found it while collecting samples in Mount Rainier National Park. I'm a botanist. I study plant death patterns. But this was different. This was wrong. I was working on a fungal decay project. Standard field research, GPS tracking, soil samples, species documentation. The morning was clear. Temperature 12 degrees Celsius, humidity 65%. Normal conditions for late spring. The circle appeared ahead of me at 09:30 hours. Sharp delineation between healthy forest and complete death. No transition zone, no gradual decay, just a perfect line where everything stopped living. I took initial readings. Soil pH normal. Moisture levels normal. No chemical contamination, no radiation, no fungal growth, no insect activity, nothing to explain the death zone. The circle's center showed heavy compression, soil packed hard as concrete. I measured the depth, 45 centimeters of compression, uniform density, perfect vertical walls to the compression zone, like something massive had stood there for hours, not moving, just standing. I found the first footprint at 09:45 hours, deep impression in the compressed soil, bipedal, humanoid, but wrong, 55 centimeters long, 28 centimeters wide at the ball of the foot. Perfect anatomical detail, but impossible size. More prints appeared. A pattern emerged, all identical depth, all same size. The being had stood in one spot but turned in place, full 360-degree rotation, prints overlapping at precise 15-degree intervals. I measured each angle, perfect precision. My equipment started malfunctioning at 1,000 hours. Soil pH meter first. Digital display showing impossible numbers, negative pH values, then the GPS, coordinates jumping randomly, then everything electronic, total failure. A sound began, deep, below human hearing range. I felt it in my chest, in my bones. Regular pulses, 7 seconds apart. I timed them, counted intervals. Perfect precision. The air changed, grew heavy, dense, hard to breathe. Temperature dropped 8 degrees in 2 minutes. My thermal sensor caught it before dying. The cold centered on the footprints, radiating outward in mathematical patterns. I found the hair samples at 10:15 hours. Thick strands, like horsehair but wrong. Too coarse, too long, unnatural color, deep black with blue iridescence. I measured them, 45 centimeters long, every strand exactly the same length. The sound changed, higher frequency now, audible, like deep earth movement but wrong, too regular, too patterned. 7-second intervals maintained, perfect timing. Analysis later showed the hair wasn't hair, not keratin, not protein, not any known organic compound. The molecular structure made no sense. Chains too complex, too ordered. Like engineered carbon nanotubes, but impossible complexity. The ground vibrated, regular pulses matching the sound. I took readings before my seismometer died. 7.0 on the Richter scale, but localized, contained within the circle. Impossible energy patterns. More footprints appeared. Fresh ones, forming in the soil without visible cause. Same size, same depth, same 15-degree intervals. Complete another rotation. I measured the compression rate. 2.3 centimeters per second. Perfect consistency. The air temperature hit 4°C. Frost formed in the dead zone. Perfect crystal patterns. Geometric shapes. Impossible complexity. Growing in synchronized waves. 7-second intervals. A smell hit me at 10:30 hours. Industrial, chemical, but wrong. No identification possible. My eyes burned, throat constricted. The air felt thick, heavy, like breathing liquid mercury. The footprints kept forming. Third rotation complete, each set exactly aligned with previous prints. Perfect overlap, perfect precision. The compression reached 60 centimeters deep, soil density impossible for normal Earth conditions. I took samples, followed procedure, soil core, plant tissue, hair strands, frost crystals. The sample bags felt wrong in my hands. Weight kept changing, mass fluctuating in 7-second intervals. The sound peaked at 10:45 hours, maximum audible frequency. The ground vibration matched it, perfect synchronization. The frost patterns grew faster, more complex, crystal structures that violated basic laws of physics. Something moved at the circle's edge, tall, massive, just beyond clear vision, like heat distortion but wrong, more solid, more purposeful. The air rippled around it. Frost patterns followed its movement. I saw it clearly for 2 seconds, 3 meters tall. Humanoid but wrong, too big, too dense. Surface like polished obsidian but moving, flowing. Internal lights pulsing in 7-second intervals. It stepped into the circle. New footprints, 55 centimeters long, perfect match to the others. The ground compressed under its weight, 2.3 centimeters per second, exactly the same rate. The air crackled, static electricity arced between dead trees, 7-second intervals. The being turned, 15 degrees, perfect precision. Its surface rippled, flowed like liquid glass. Internal lights pulsed faster. I ran, dropped my pack. Abandoned procedure, pure instinct. The sound followed me, the vibrations followed me. 7-second intervals, perfect timing. The temperature rose the further I got from the circle. I reported environmental damage, couldn't tell them what I really saw. The response team found the circle, took readings, samples, measurements. Everything matched my numbers, everything confirmed the impossible. The footprints remained, 55 centimeters long, 3 rotations, 15-degree intervals, perfect precision. The compression zone went down 60 centimeters, soil density beyond Earth normal. They found my pack. All electronic equipment dead, batteries drained, circuit boards crystallized, perfect geometric patterns in the metal, like frost patterns but permanent. Impossible complexity. The response team installed monitors, seismic sensors, temperature gauges. Everything died within 24 hours, but they recorded something first. 7-second intervals, perfect timing, energy readings that broke the equipment. The circle remains dead. Nothing grows there, nothing lives there. The footprints stay fresh. New ones appear every 7 days. Same size, same depth, same 15-degree intervals. Always 3 rotations, always perfect precision. I've analyzed the samples, studied the patterns, the crystallization, the soil compression, the molecular structures. Nothing makes sense. Nothing follows natural law. Everything shows impossible precision. The sound still comes, every 7 days, deep frequency, 7-second intervals. The ground still vibrates, the air still gets heavy. And sometimes when I check the monitors, I see something on the infrared. 3 meters tall. Surface like flowing glass. Internal lights pulsing in 7-second intervals. It's still there. Still measuring. Still turning in 15-degree intervals. Still leaving footprints that defy physics. And every 7 days, in that perfect circle of death, something impossible returns to continue its survey. We were all excited that day. It was supposed to be a simple hike, a chance to get away from everything, to enjoy the outdoors, and to take some pictures along the way. Just me, Marco, Jessica, and Travis. We had picked a trail that wasn't too crowded, not one of those well-known ones where you run into a bunch of families or other groups. It was quieter, a little more off the beaten path, and we liked it that way. We left early in the morning. The sun was just starting to rise when we parked the car, a pale light breaking through the treetops, and the air was still cold. I zipped up my jacket, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and adjusted the straps. Marco had his camera ready, the big one with the extra lenses. He was always talking about getting the perfect shot. Jessica had her phone out, snapping pictures of the forest and laughing at the weird angles Travis was making with his arms. We started on the trail, the ground crunching under our boots, the air crisp. It was perfect, quiet, cool, the kind of place that made you feel like you could breathe deeply for once. The trail was narrow, winding through tall trees that seemed to close in over us as we walked. There was something comforting about it. Just us, no sounds but the occasional bird call or the rustle of leaves. We hiked for hours, taking our time. We stopped now and then, so Marco could take some photos. He'd tell us to stay still while he tried to frame a shot of the trees or get us in the picture with the forest behind us. I liked how relaxed it felt. No pressure to rush, no place we had to be except right there. We were about halfway through the trail when Marco got that look on his face, the one he got when he thought he found something cool. He had his camera up, pointing into the distance, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Hold on," he said, motioning for us to stop. He squinted, adjusting the focus on the camera. "There's something over there, like a perfect angle with the sun." Travis rolled his eyes, but we stopped, waiting. Jessica and I exchanged glances and smiled. We were used to Marco's fascination with random shots. He was always talking about getting the lighting just right, or the perfect blend of shadows and light. He took the picture and lowered the camera, grinning at us. "Got it," he said, and we started walking again. We kept going, taking more pictures along the way. Everything seemed normal, nothing weird, nothing off. But the further we went, the thicker the trees seemed to get, the narrower the path became, and the quieter the woods felt. It was that kind of quiet that makes you feel like you should whisper, like anything louder would somehow be wrong. We reached a small clearing, and Marco handed the camera to Jessica to get a picture of him and Travis. She took a few shots, and then Marco grabbed the camera back, flipping through the photos, checking the screen. And that's when he stopped, his face going still, his eyes narrowing. He squinted at the screen, his mouth tightening. "What's up?" I asked, stepping closer to see what he was looking at. "There's something in the background," he said, his voice low. I moved in, peering over his shoulder at the small screen. It was a shot of the trail, taken a while back, with the 3 of us walking ahead of Marco. But behind us, way in the distance, there was something dark, almost hidden in the shadows. It was tall, standing between 2 trees, and it looked like it was watching us. A chill ran down my spine. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Jessica leaned in, her eyes going wide. "Is that a person?" she asked. "It looks like it," Travis said, his voice uncertain. He took the camera from Marco, zooming in on the screen. The figure was blurry, almost just a shadow, but there was no mistaking it. It was definitely a person, standing still, watching. We all stared at the picture for a long moment. The air felt colder now, the trees seeming to press in around us. "Could just be a hiker," Marco said, but his voice didn't have much conviction. He kept looking at the screen, his brow furrowed. "Why would they be just standing there?" Jessica asked. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the trees. "And why didn't we see them?" No one had an answer. I could feel my heartbeat picking up, the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. The forest didn't feel as inviting anymore. It felt different, darker, almost threatening. "Let's just keep moving," I said. "Maybe they're gone now, probably just someone messing around." We all nodded, though no one looked convinced. We started walking again, faster this time, our eyes darting to the sides of the trail, scanning the trees. The laughter was gone now, the light mood replaced by a sense of tension. I could feel it in the air, in the way we moved, in the silence that had settled over us. The trail twisted and turned, the path almost disappearing under the thick carpet of leaves. I kept looking back, expecting to see someone behind us, but there was nothing, just shadows, trees, and the feeling of being watched. We didn't stop to take pictures anymore. We just kept moving, our footsteps crunching on the ground, the air growing colder as the sun dipped lower. The feeling wouldn't go away, that sense that we weren't alone, that somewhere, out there in the trees, someone was watching, following. Marco was ahead, his camera still around his neck. He kept glancing at it, like he wanted to check the pictures again, but he didn't. I think he was afraid of what he'd see. We reached another clearing, and I stopped, turning to look back the way we had come. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in short bursts. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling was still there, that tightness in my chest, the sense that we were being followed. "Guys," I said, my voice trembling, "I think we should head back. I don't like this." Jessica nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, let's just go." We turned, ready to head back the way we came. But then Marco raised his camera, pointing it towards the tree line, his face going pale. "Wait," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He snapped a picture, the sound loud in the silence. "What is it?" I asked, my heart skipping a beat. He didn't answer. He just lowered the camera, staring at the screen, his face tense. He turned the camera around, showing us the picture. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. Closer now, I could see it more clearly, a dark shape, tall, almost blending into the shadows. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching us. A jolt of fear shot through me, my skin prickled, my stomach twisting in knots. "Who is that?" Travis whispered, his voice shaking. He turned, his eyes scanning the trees. "Where did they go?" I looked up, my eyes darting around the clearing, but there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the cold wind rustling the leaves. "Let's go," I said, my voice urgent. "Now." We started moving, faster this time, almost running. The trail seemed longer now, the trees thicker, the shadows darker. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow, my heart pounding in my ears. I kept glancing back, expecting to see the figure following us, but there was nothing. Just the feeling, that heavy, oppressive feeling that made it hard to breathe. We didn't stop until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and unlocked the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut, the sound echoing through the empty parking lot. Marco was in the passenger seat, his camera still clutched in his hands. He looked over at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. "Just go," he said, his voice tight. I didn't need to be told twice. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of the lot, the tires skidding on the gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if there was anything there, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. We drove in silence for a long time, the tension in the car thick, the air heavy. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. No one spoke, no one dared to. It wasn't until we were miles away, the forest far behind us, that Marco finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "I don't think that was a hiker," he said. He turned the camera around, looking at the picture again, his brow furrowed. Jessica shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "What do you mean?" Marco shook his head, his eyes still on the screen. "I don't know, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't just standing there. It felt like it was waiting." A chill ran down my spine, my stomach twisting. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to remember the way it had looked, the way it had just stood there watching. "We're not going back there," I said, my voice firm. I glanced over at Marco, meeting his eyes. "Ever?" He nodded, his face serious. "Yeah, we're done with that place." We drove the rest of the way in silence. The image of that figure burned into my mind. I couldn't shake it. The way it had just stood there still, almost blending into the shadows. The way it had followed us, closer each time, like it was waiting for something. We didn't talk about it after that. We tried to move on, to forget. But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet and the world feels too still, I think about that figure. I think about those eyes, watching us, following us, and I wonder if it's still out there, somewhere, waiting. And I can't help but feel that somehow it is. I felt the eyes first. A physical pressure on the back of my neck, like being targeted through a scope. 6 hours into the hike, something started watching me. My name is Yuki Tanaka. I'm an experienced mountaineer, been climbing in the Cascades for 12 years. What followed me on Mount Baker last week doesn't match anything I've encountered before. I was doing a solo trek on the Heliotrope Ridge Trail. Perfect conditions, clear October day, good visibility, light wind. Started at dawn, made good time up the first section. The wildlife went quiet at 1 p.m., not gradual, like a switch flipped. Birds stopped, insects went silent, even the wind seemed to die. That's when I felt it. Eyes on my back, constant pressure, making my skin crawl, making the hair on my neck stand up. I kept walking, kept my pace steady, but I heard it start. Branches breaking behind me, heavy steps, always the same distance back, always matching my speed exactly. I stopped to check my map. The footsteps stopped too. Perfect synchronization. I could hear breathing now, deep, powerful breaths, like something with massive lungs trying to be quiet. The steps were wrong, too heavy for a person, too regular for a bear. The spacing was off, like something with an unnaturally long stride. I took out my camera, started documenting. Every time I stopped, the footsteps stopped. Every time I moved, they moved. Perfect mimicry, perfect control. At 2 p.m., I reached a clearing. Open ground, good visibility. I turned around slowly, scanned the tree line with my camera. Nothing visible. But the breathing was clear now, coming from a spot about 8 feet up, a large pine tree. No animal I knew could breathe like that from that height. I kept hiking. The footsteps resumed, but now there was something new. A soft clicking sound, like bones being tapped together, rhythmic, deliberate. The clicking had a pattern, 3 quick, 2 slow, over and over, like a signal, like communication. I recorded everything on my phone, the footsteps, the breathing, the clicking, evidence, documentation, something to prove what was happening. At 3 p.m. I found the first tracks, huge impressions in a patch of mud, 20 inches long at least, bipedal, 6-foot stride length, fresh, still filling with water, I photographed them, used my hiking poles for scale. The pattern was clear. Something huge walking upright had made these tracks less than an hour ago. The breathing was closer now, the clicking louder, the footsteps more deliberate, testing distance, testing reaction. I reached my planned campsite at 4 p.m., started setting up my tent with shaking hands. The whole time, the breathing circled the site, moving between trees, always about 8 feet up. The camera caught glimpses, just fragments, something massive moving with impossible speed between trunks. Dark fur, long arms, but never a clear shot. As dusk fell, the clicking changed. More complex patterns, different rhythms, like it was trying different signals, waiting for a response. I sat in my tent, recording everything, the breathing patterns, the clicking sequences, the movement around the camp, evidence of something impossible. At midnight, the light hit them. I was scanning the tree line with my headlamp when I caught the eye shine. 2 reflective points about 8 feet up, too high for any known predator. The eyes stayed fixed on my tent, unblinking, unmoving. The clicking continued. The breathing deepened. Hours passed. Just before dawn, it changed position, moved to a different tree, same height, same unblinking stare. But now I could hear something else. Vocalizations, deep, resonant sounds, complex patterns, almost like speech, but wrong. Too deep, too structured. I recorded everything. The sun rose, the eyes vanished, the breathing stopped, the clicking faded. But the tracks remained. Perfect circles around my campsite. Huge footprints, 20-inch length, 6-foot stride. Every circle exactly 6 feet from the last. Precise, deliberate. I broke camp fast, started hiking out. The footsteps resumed behind me, same distance, same pace. But now the clicking was constant, more urgent, more complex patterns. The eyes followed me the whole way. I could feel them, 8 feet up, moving through the trees, keeping pace effortlessly. Sometimes I caught glimpses, dark shape moving with impossible speed, massive shoulders, long arms, always just at the edge of vision. The breathing got closer as I neared the trailhead, the clicking more intense, like it was running out of time, like it had something to communicate. I reached my car at noon, started the engine. In my rearview mirror, I saw it clearly for the first time, standing at the tree line, 8 feet tall at least, massive build, dark fur, just watching, then gone, faster than anything that size should move. I drove straight to the ranger station, showed them my photos, the recordings, the videos. They called in experts. The research team arrived that evening, set up equipment on the trail, thermal cameras, audio recorders, motion sensors. The cameras caught heat signatures, something huge moving faster than possible. The audio equipment recorded those complex vocalizations. The motion sensors tracked impossible patterns of movement. They took samples from the tracks, measured everything, documented it all. But they published nothing officially, just installed permanent monitoring stations and restricted trail access. I've studied the evidence for months, the photos, the recordings, the tracks. Everything points to something intelligent operating on that mountain, something that watches, signals, tries to communicate. The monitoring stations are still active, still tracking movement at night, still recording those clicking patterns, still documenting something impossible moving through those ancient forests. The tracks remain clear in my photos. The recordings still capture those complex vocalizations. The thermal images still show something that shouldn't exist, something that can move with impossible speed, something that thinks, plans, tries to communicate through patterns of clicks and calls. And somewhere on Mount Baker, it waits, watches, signals into the darkness. I still have all the data, all the evidence, proof of something that shouldn't exist, something that walks on 2 legs but isn't human, something intelligent, patient, precise. The cameras keep recording, the sensors keep tracking, the audio equipment keeps capturing those complex patterns of clicks and calls. Every night, new signals echo through the forest. New patterns of movement appear on the monitors. New attempts at communication, waiting to be heard, waiting to be understood, waiting. The feeling of those eyes still haunts me. That constant pressure, that sense of being watched by something impossible. And somewhere on that mountain, it still watches, still signals, still tries to make contact through patterns of clicks and calls, waiting for someone to answer. The evidence remains. The tracks, the recordings, the thermal images, physical proof of something impossible moving through familiar woods, watching, signaling, waiting. The thermal anomaly followed a pattern. I saw it first through my drone's infrared camera while mapping the Sierra Madre Oriental. I'm a cartographer. I map terrain variations. But this wasn't a terrain feature. This was something else. Something moving with purpose. The morning started normal. Clear sky. 22nd degree C. Light wind from the northwest. I was using a DJI Mavic 3 Enterprise with thermal imaging for terrain heat mapping. Standard procedure, grid pattern sweeps, data logging, everything by the book. The anomaly appeared at 0845 hours, a heat signature moving through the forest, temperature reading 42 degrees 6, too hot for any local wildlife, too consistent for fire. The movement pattern caught my attention first, systematic, deliberate, like a search grid. I adjusted the drone's height. 100 meters. Clear view of the thermal signature. The shape was wrong. Bipedal. Canine features, but massive. I calculated the height using tree references. 2.5 meters tall, moving on two legs with impossible smoothness. The thermal image showed internal temperature variations, regular pulses of heat, 40-second intervals. I timed them, counted the cycles. Perfect precision. No biological system maintains that kind of regularity. The drone's GPS started glitching at 0900 hours, coordinates jumping, altitude readings fluctuating, but the thermal camera kept recording. The anomaly maintained its search pattern, perfect grid lines, 90-degree turns, military precision. I launched the backup drone. Different model, different systems, started recording from the opposite direction. The anomaly responded, changed its search grid, adapted to cover the new observation angle. Intelligent modification of pattern. The thermal signature pulsed brighter. Internal temperature hit 47 degrees 6. The heat pattern changed. Concentric rings expanding outward. Regular intervals. Mathematical precision, like a broadcast pattern. Both drones' control systems failed simultaneously at 0915 hours. Different manufacturers, different frequencies, both dropped from 100 meters, straight down, no glide, no auto-rotation, like they hit a wall. I found the first drone, impact crater normal for the fall, but the electronics, the circuit boards showed crystallization patterns, perfect geometric formations in the metal. The memory card survived. The last images showed something impossible. The thermal anomaly had looked up. Direct eye contact with the camera. The head shape was wrong. Canine but distorted. Too angular. Too precise. The body temperature spiked to 52 degrees Celsius in that final frame. Then transmission cut. The second drone was worse. Melted. Not from impact. From heat. The aluminum frame showed flow patterns, mathematical precision in the way it melted. The thermal camera's last image remained burned into the sensor, permanent, like a photographic negative. I heard it then, a low-frequency pulse, 40-second intervals, perfect timing, the same pattern as the thermal pulses. The sound made my teeth vibrate. My chest cavity resonated with each pulse, movement in the forest. Large, deliberate, still following the search grid pattern. The thermal signature visible to naked eye now. Heat distortion in the air. Perfect geometric patterns in the distortion. I took photos with my phone. Standard procedure. Document everything. The images corrupted instantly. Not random corruption. Organized. The digital artifacts formed the same geometric patterns as the heat distortion. Trees cracked, not breaking. Precision cuts, 90-degree angles, like the search grid pattern carved into wood. I measured the cuts later, 5 centimeters deep. Perfect depth consistency. Clean edges, no tool marks. The sound changed at 0930 hours. Higher frequency, still 40-second intervals. My phone died. GPS unit died. Radio died. Even my mechanical compass failed. The needle spun in geometric patterns, matching the search grid. I saw it clearly then. Full daylight. No thermal distortion, no camera effects, just pure visual contact. The size estimate was correct. 2.5 meters tall. Canine head but wrong. Proportions impossible. Angular features too precise. Body shape fluid but geometric. Moving like digital animation made real. It turned toward me. The movement was wrong. Too smooth. Too precise. Each motion exactly calculated. No natural fluid dynamics. No muscle physics. Pure mathematical movement. The eyes locked on my position. Solid red. Internal light pulsing in 40-second intervals. Perfect timing. The head tilted exactly 45 degrees. I measured the angle in the photos that survived. Perfect precision. It moved. Covered 50 meters in 2 seconds. No acceleration. No deceleration. Constant velocity. Impossible physics. The heat distortion followed it. Geometric patterns in the air growing more complex. The sound peaked. Maximum frequency. My ears popped. Air pressure dropped. Temperature rose 15 degrees in 10 seconds. The creature's thermal signature now visible as pure white light. I ran. Basic survival instinct. No conscious thought. Pure reaction. The sound followed. 40-second intervals. Perfect timing. The geometric patterns spread through the forest. Trees cut at precise angles. Ground carved in search grid patterns. The creature matched my course. Parallel movement. Perfect spacing. 50 meters exact. I measured it later in the satellite images. The thermal signature left scorched earth. Geometric burn patterns. Perfect precision. New sound started. Higher pitch. Like radio signals but audible. Patterns in the sound. Mathematical sequences. Binary code. I recorded it on my backup phone. Analysis later showed impossible information density. The creature stopped at the forest edge. Perfect halt. No deceleration. The heat distortion formed a dome. Perfect hemisphere. I measured the radius later. 100 meters exactly. The geometric patterns within the dome rotated. 40-second intervals. My electronics revived instantly. All systems normal. No explanation. The thermal signature vanished. The sound stopped. The temperature dropped to normal. Just like that. Complete cessation. I reported equipment failure and forest damage. Couldn't explain the real cause. The response team found the evidence. Geometric cuts in trees. Search grid patterns carved in earth. Burn marks in perfect mathematical sequences. The drones were gone. Just gone. No debris. No trace. But the thermal images survived in the cloud backup. The creature's pattern analysis survived. Perfect search grid. Perfect mathematical precision. Intelligent adaptation to observation. The response team installed sensors, motion detectors, thermal cameras. Everything died within 40 seconds of activation, but they caught something first. The search pattern continues. Different section of forest each time. Perfect grid lines, 90-degree turns, military precision. The geometric patterns spread. More trees show precise cuts. More ground bears the search grid marks. The pattern expands exactly 1 kilometer each 40 days. Perfect rate. Perfect precision. I've analyzed the data, studied the patterns. The geometric progression, the mathematical sequences, the binary codes in the recorded sounds, it's all building toward something precise, something calculated. The Forest Service closed that sector, posted warnings about unstable ground, but we know that's not why. Ground doesn't cut itself in search patterns, trees don't slice themselves at perfect angles, and thermal signatures don't move with mathematical precision, searching for something we can't comprehend. Sometimes I review the thermal footage, study the patterns, the search grid modifications, the intelligent adaptations, and sometimes, in the background noise, I hear it. 40-second intervals, perfect timing, binary code carrying impossible information. The search continues, the pattern expands, and somewhere in that forest, something moves with geometric precision, mapping the world in mathematical patterns we were never meant to understand. The fog rolled in faster than I expected. I'd set up camp near the valley because it looked like a good spot, flat ground, and enough open space to keep an eye on things. It was supposed to be an easy, relaxing night, away from all the noise of town, just me and the quiet of nature. I liked the idea of being alone, the idea of just getting away from everything. But I didn't plan for the fog. It started as a thin mist, hanging low on the grass, swirling around my feet while I gathered firewood. I thought it looked kind of cool at first, the way it hugged the ground, soft and silent. But then it started getting thicker, creeping up, swallowing the space around me until the trees disappeared into the haze. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon, and I could still see a faint glow in the sky, but everything below was covered in grey. I walked back to camp, keeping my eyes on the faint shape of my tent in the distance, not wanting to lose sight of it. By the time I got back, the fog was heavy. It pressed in around me, muffling the sounds of the forest, swallowing the echoes of my footsteps. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The air felt cold, damp, and it stuck to my skin. I dropped the firewood next to the pit I'd dug earlier and glanced around, uneasy. Everything looked different in the fog. Shapes twisted, shadows seemed to move, and I found myself squinting into the haze, trying to make sense of the shapes around me. I set up a small fire, the crackle of the flames a welcome sound in the thick silence. The light from the fire didn't reach far. It felt like it was being swallowed up, barely making a dent in the grey. I sat close to it, staring into the flames, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was stupid. I knew that. There was no one out here but me. But the fog had a way of making everything feel off, of making every rustle and creak sound like something moving closer. The first time I saw them, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I glanced up from the fire, and there they were. Tall, thin silhouettes, standing just at the edge of the light. I blinked, my breath catching, and they were gone. I stared into the fog, my heart pounding, my eyes straining to see. Nothing. Just grey, shifting shadows. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. It was the fog, messing with my head. I'd heard about that kind of thing before. People seeing things that weren't there when the fog rolled in. I told myself that's all it was. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept looking up, my eyes darting around, searching the edges of the light. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared. The kind of scared that sits in your chest, heavy and cold, making it hard to breathe. Every time the fire flickered, every time the shadows moved, I found myself holding my breath, waiting. It wasn't long before I saw them again. This time, there were more. Figures, tall and thin, standing perfectly still just beyond the reach of the firelight. I could see them clearly, dark shapes, barely more than outlines, but they were there. I wasn't imagining it. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands shaking as I reached for the flashlight beside me. I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the fog, and pointed it towards where I'd seen them. Nothing. The light hit empty fog, the trees barely visible in the distance, but I knew what I'd seen. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I turned the flashlight off and set it back down, my eyes still on the edge of the light. The figures were gone, but the fear stayed. It wrapped around me, tight, and I couldn't shake it. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth of the flames, the crackling wood. But every time I looked up, I expected to see them. And every time I did, they were closer. I tried to stay calm, tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired, that the fog was making everything look strange. But I couldn't convince myself. The figures kept coming back, each time closer than before. I could see them standing there, watching, always watching. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, tall and still, like they were waiting for something. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, the sudden movement making the firewood shift, sending a burst of sparks into the air. My hands were shaking, my breath coming fast. I grabbed the flashlight again, the metal cold in my hand, and shone it out into the fog. I swept the beam back and forth, my heart pounding. Nothing. No figures, no movement. Just fog, endless and thick. I turned back to the fire, my stomach twisting. I didn't want to be here anymore. The fog made everything feel wrong, made the night feel darker, heavier. I just wanted to pack up and get out. But the thought of stepping into the fog, of leaving the light of the fire behind, made my skin prickle with fear. I sat back down, my eyes never leaving the edge of the light. The figures were gone again, but I knew they'd be back. I could feel it. The air felt wrong, the fog too thick, too cold. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the shivering. The fire crackled, but it didn't feel warm anymore. And then I heard it. A rustling sound, soft, coming from somewhere in the fog. My breath caught, my body tensing. It was close. Too close. I shone the flashlight towards the sound, the beam cutting through the grey. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A shape, moving just beyond the trees. But it was gone before I could be sure. I stood up again, my heart pounding, my eyes darting around. The rustling continued, moving through the fog, circling the camp. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the flashlight steady. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I turned back towards my tent, the small shape barely visible through the fog. I needed to get inside, needed to put something between me and whatever was out there. I moved quickly, my steps uneven, the fog swirling around my legs. I unzipped the tent, practically diving inside, and zipped it up behind me, the sound loud in the silence. I sat there, the flashlight still in my hand, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The tent felt too small, too thin. I could hear the rustling outside, moving back and forth, getting closer, then fading away. I held my breath, listening, every muscle in my body tensed. The flashlight beam wavered, the light barely making a dent in the darkness of the tent. I kept it pointed at the entrance, waiting, my heart pounding in my ears. The rustling grew louder, closer, until it was right outside. I could see the tent fabric move, the faint outline of a hand pressing against it. A jolt of fear shot through me, and I scrambled back, my hands shaking, the flashlight slipping from my grip. The hand moved slowly, sliding down the side of the tent, the fabric shifting under the pressure. I couldn't breathe, my chest tight, my pulse racing. I grabbed the flashlight, my fingers fumbling, and pointed it at the spot where the hand had been. The light hit empty fabric, the tent still. The rustling stopped, and the silence that followed was deafening. I sat there, my back pressed against the far wall of the tent, the flashlight beam shaking as I held it. I waited, listening, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing, just the thick, heavy silence of the fog. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, the fear sitting heavy in my chest, my hands trembling. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. I just sat there, the flashlight pointed at the entrance, waiting. Eventually, the fog began to lift. I could see the first light of dawn breaking through the fabric of the tent, the grey giving way to pale morning light. The rustling was gone, the figures nowhere to be seen, but the fear didn't leave. It clung to me, cold and heavy, even as the sun rose. I unzipped the tent slowly, my hands still shaking, and peeked outside. The fog was thinning, the trees becoming clearer, the shapes that had haunted me fading into nothing. I stepped out, my legs unsteady, my breath catching in my throat. The camp was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, the ground around it covered in ash. There was no sign of the figures, no footprints, nothing to prove that they had been there. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly, my eyes darting to the trees, the fog still clinging to the ground in patches. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to. The air still felt wrong, heavy, like the valley was holding its breath, waiting. I left the camp behind, my steps quick, my heart pounding. I could feel eyes on me, the figures still there, somewhere in the fog, watching. The sun was rising, the light growing stronger, but the fear stayed. It followed me out of the valley, clinging to my skin, settling deep in my bones. I haven't been back since. I don't think I ever will. The memory of those figures, standing there in the fog, still haunts me. The way they watched, silent and still, like they were waiting for something. The way they disappeared when the light hit them, only to come back, closer each time. I try not to think about it, try to push it out of my mind. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the fog rolls in, I see them again. Tall, thin silhouettes, standing just at the edge of the light, waiting. And I know deep down that they're still out there, somewhere, watching. The first structure appeared on Tuesday, just branches and logs woven together. But the construction was wrong, too precise, too engineered. No human built this. My name is Diego Ramirez. I'm a ranger at Mount Rainier National Park. 10 years on the job. What I found during my patrols last month defies explanation. I discovered the structure during routine trail maintenance. 10 feet tall, conical shape, built from local materials. But the engineering was impossible. Load-bearing calculations that would require advanced mathematics. I photographed everything. Standard procedure. The construction method was clear. Each piece selected for specific structural properties, each joint precisely weighted, like something had designed it for maximum stability. The base diameter was exactly 12 feet, the height exactly 10 feet. Perfect proportions, perfect symmetry, no tools marks, no rope, just raw materials woven together with impossible precision. I reported it to park headquarters. They said they'd send someone to investigate, called it unusual human activity. But I knew better. I'd seen human shelters. This was different. The next day, I found 3 more. Same dimensions, same engineering, forming a perfect equilateral triangle with the first structure at the center. The spacing was exact, 50 yards between each point. More photos, more measurements, more documentation. The pattern was expanding, growing, following some kind of plan. That night, I heard the construction, heavy objects being moved, branches breaking, methodical work sounds, but too fast, too efficient for human hands. I set up my trail camera, had to document whatever was building these things. The night vision footage showed glimpses, something huge moving between the structures, 8 feet tall at least, working with impossible speed and precision. The third day brought 9 more structures, perfect geometric pattern, each exactly 50 yards from its neighbors, each identical in dimension and engineering. The mathematical precision was beyond human capability. I found the first tracks that morning, huge footprints, 24 inches long, bipedal, 8-foot stride length, moving between the structures in perfectly straight lines. The pattern started making sense. The structures were nodes, connection points, creating some kind of grid across the landscape. That night, I watched from my truck, the camera recording everything. The construction sounds were constant, moving from point to point, building with superhuman speed and precision. At midnight, something new started, deep resonant sounds like huge drums beneath the earth, each structure vibrating in sequence, creating complex patterns of sound. I recorded everything, the construction, the sounds, the vibrations, evidence of something impossible at work in my park. The fourth day brought 27 structures, perfect mathematical progression, the grid expanding, the pattern growing more complex. The research team arrived that afternoon, set up equipment, thermal cameras, audio recorders, seismic monitors, created a perimeter around the grid. That night, they caught everything. Clear thermal signatures of something massive moving between structures, audio recordings of those deep resonant sounds, seismic patterns that shouldn't be possible. They took samples, measured everything, documented it all, but they published nothing officially, just installed permanent monitoring stations and restricted access to the area. The structures kept appearing, each night bringing more, each addition following perfect mathematical progression, the grid expanding according to some alien geometry. The cameras kept recording, catching glimpses of something huge moving with impossible speed, working with materials like they weighed nothing, building with precision beyond human capability. The audio recordings captured more, those deep resonant sounds, complex patterns, almost like communications passing through the earth itself. Then it spread, similar structures appearing in other parts of the park, other rangers reporting identical findings, always the same dimensions, always the same precise engineering. The monitoring expanded, more cameras, more sensors. The data kept coming, thermal signatures of multiple massive entities moving in coordination, audio recordings of complex harmonic patterns, seismic data showing impossible energy transfers between structures. I've studied the evidence for months, the photos, the recordings, the structural analysis. Everything points to something intelligent operating in these forests, something that builds, plans, communicates through mathematics and sound. The structures remain, over 300 now, perfect geometric grid covering 20 square miles. Each one identical, each one part of some vast pattern we can't comprehend. The cameras are still recording, still catching glimpses of huge shapes moving between nodes, still documenting impossible feats of engineering happening in darkness. The audio equipment keeps capturing those deep resonant sounds, complex harmonics passing through the earth, patterns growing more intricate with each passing night. And somewhere in this forest, they keep building, keep expanding their grid, keep sending their signals through stone and soil. I still have all the data, all the evidence, proof of something that shouldn't exist, something that builds with impossible precision, something that communicates through mathematics and vibration. The monitoring stations keep recording, the sensors keep tracking movement, the seismic equipment keeps logging those complex patterns of energy. Every night, new structures appear, new nodes in their growing network, new points in their vast geometric pattern. The engineering remains perfect, the mathematics precise, the purpose unknown. Something walks these forests at night, something that builds with superhuman skill, something that thinks in geometry and speaks through the earth itself. The evidence is clear in my photos. in the recordings, in the seismic data, physical proof of impossible intelligence at work in familiar woods, building, expanding, communicating through their growing grid of structures, waiting to be understood. The first structure still stands, still exactly 10 feet tall, still precisely engineered, still marking the center of something vast and incomprehensible. And somewhere in Mount Rainier National Park, they keep building, keep expanding, keep sending their harmonic messages through stone and soil. The grid grows, the pattern expands, the purpose remains unknown, but the evidence is undeniable. Something walks these forests, something builds with impossible skill, something communicates through mathematics and vibration. We record their work, document their patterns, map their expanding grid, and wait to understand what they're building, what they're saying, what they want. The scratch marks followed rules, mathematical rules. I discovered them while documenting cave art in Huacachina. I'm an archaeologist specializing in ancient symbolic patterns, but these weren't ancient, and they weren't symbolic. They were being made as I watched. The tunnels appeared during a routine survey, not on any map, no previous documentation. I found the entrance at 1400 hours, perfect circular opening, 2 meters diameter, precise circumference. The walls showed tool marks too clean for primitive methods, too precise for modern ones. Temperature inside, 18 degrees Celsius, humidity, 72%, normal for the region. I had standard equipment, LED headlamp, backup lights, cameras, measuring tools, sample bags. The tunnel descended at exactly 32 degrees. I measured the angle multiple times. Perfect consistency. The first marks appeared 50 meters in, 3 parallel lines, deep in the stone. I measured them, 12 centimeters long, 3 centimeters deep, spaced exactly 7 centimeters apart. The edges were impossibly clean, like the stone had parted at molecular level. More marks appeared as I went deeper. The pattern emerged slowly, not random scratches, mathematical sequences. I recognized Fibonacci spirals, golden ratios, but wrong, altered. The sequences extended into dimensions that shouldn't exist. My headlamp flickered at 14:30 hours, brand new batteries. The backup lights showed the same problem. The marks seemed to absorb light, not reflect it, not scatter it, just absorb it, like looking into micro black holes. I took samples, stone chips, dust from the grooves. The sample bags felt wrong. Weight kept shifting, mass fluctuating according to mathematical progressions. I measured it, graphed it, perfect sine waves in the weight variation. The temperature dropped at 14:45 hours, down to 12 degrees 6. No natural explanation, no air movement. The humidity rose to 85%. The walls started sweating. The liquid wasn't water. Too thick, too iridescent. It followed the patterns in the marks. Movement caught my attention, something at the edge of my light. Fast, fluid, but wrong, like watching stop-motion animation at high speed. The motion followed the mathematical patterns in the wall marks. Perfect precision. The scratching started at 1500 hours. Sharp, metallic, coming from deeper in the tunnel. Regular intervals. I timed them. 7 seconds between each sound. Perfect rhythm. The marks in the walls grew as I watched, extended themselves, following rules I could almost grasp. My cameras malfunctioned. Digital displays showed impossible numbers. Memory cards filled with mathematical symbols. Binary code that made no sense. The mechanical camera worked. The film showed everything. Too much. Something moved again. Closer now. Tall. Impossibly thin. Limbs too long. Too many joints. Skin like white stone. But moving. Flowing. The proportions followed the mathematical patterns in the walls. Golden ratios made flesh. The marks spread faster. 3 parallel lines. Always 3. Cutting through solid rock like it was fog. The patterns grew more complex. 4-dimensional equations written in stone. My eyes hurt trying to follow them. My brain refused to process the shapes. The temperature hit 8 degrees. The iridescent liquid flowed upward. Defied gravity in predictable patterns, 4.7-second intervals, the same as the scratching sound. I documented everything, measured everything, the numbers all connected, all followed impossible rules. The thing moved into my light at 15:15 hours. Full visibility, 3 meters tall, body like a living equation. Joints bent in golden ratios, fingers too long, too many segments. Writing on the walls with 3 parallel digits. Perfect precision, no face. Just smooth white stone where features should be. The surface rippled in mathematical patterns, Fibonacci sequences in living tissue. It moved like flowing water, but wrong. Each motion precisely calculated. Nothing organic, nothing random. The scratching sound came from its fingers. 3 parallel digits carving equations into rock. No effort, no resistance. The stone parted at molecular level. Perfect cuts, perfect patterns. The mathematics grew more complex, spread across walls, floor, ceiling. My headlamp died. Backup lights died. The thing generated its own illumination. Soft white light pulsing in 4.7-second intervals. Its body followed the pulse. Expanded and contracted in golden ratios. Perfect geometric progression. The air changed at 15:30 hours. Grew thick, heavy with mathematical potential. Each breath felt like inhaling equations. My lungs burned. Brain struggled to process air that followed non-Euclidean rules. The humidity hit 97%. The iridescent liquid flowed in complex patterns. The thing turned toward me. Smooth white face rippled, formed and reformed equations. Its body moved in impossible ways. Joints bent backward, forward, sideways, all simultaneously, all following mathematical law. The scratching reached maximum frequency. The walls filled with patterns. Equations spread like living things, growing, multiplying, following rules just beyond human comprehension. The air vibrated with mathematical precision. I ran, pure instinct, animal brain overriding scientific curiosity. The thing followed, smooth, silent, each step precisely calculated. Its fingers kept writing, kept scratching equations into reality. The patterns spread behind me, chased me through the tunnels. My equipment died at 15:45 hours, everything electronic. Even mechanical devices failed. Gears locked in golden ratios, springs curved in Fibonacci spirals. The mathematical infection spread through metal and plastic. The tunnel entrance remained open. Natural light looked wrong after the mathematical darkness. The thing stopped at the threshold. Precise halt. No deceleration. Its body rippled one last time. The patterns on its surface showed me everything. All mathematics, all reality. Too much for human mind. I reported tunnel collapse. Couldn't tell them the truth. The response team found the entrance, took readings, measurements. The tunnel descended at exactly 32 degrees. The marks covered every surface. 3 parallel lines. Mathematical patterns that hurt to look at. They installed sensors, seismic monitors, video cameras. Everything died within 4.7 seconds, but they recorded something first. The scratching continues. The patterns spread. The equations grow more complex. Reality bends around mathematical law. The military took over, classified everything, but they can't hide the changes. The patterns appear above ground now. 3 parallel lines in tree bark, in rock faces, in metal surfaces, always following mathematical rules, always growing more complex. I've analyzed the samples, what's left of them. The mass still fluctuates in sine waves. The iridescent liquid still flows against gravity. The stone shows molecular changes that shouldn't be possible. Reality rewritten by mathematical law. The scratching continues, 4.7-second intervals, perfect timing. The patterns spread half a meter each day, precise rate. The equations grow more complex, more alien. Reality bends further around mathematical truth. Sometimes I review the film footage, study the patterns, the thing's movements, the mathematical progression. And sometimes in the background noise, I hear it. 3 parallel digits scratching equations into the walls of reality, rewriting the world in patterns we were never meant to know. The military sealed the tunnel, posted guards, but they can't stop mathematics, can't stop truth. The patterns spread, the equations grow, and somewhere in that mathematical darkness, something moves with perfect precision, scratching new laws of reality into the walls of our world. It was supposed to be a calm night, just another routine camping trip. Johan and I had done this a dozen times before. We'd been out here in the forest since that afternoon, setting up our little camp next to a clearing not too far from the lake. There was nothing unusual about the spot, a level area, thick trees around, and a sky wide open above us. It was supposed to be easy, supposed to be fun. We were sitting around the campfire, the flames flickering up, the wood crackling in that comforting, familiar way. Johan was on his second beer, and I was on my first. The night was cool with a gentle breeze, and everything felt right. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, now that I think about it. Usually by that time of night, you could hear the sounds of bugs, maybe an owl or some small rustlings of animals in the underbrush. But it was just silent. Johan was talking about his latest work issue, something about his boss, something that made him roll his eyes and make jokes about quitting. I laughed, but I wasn't paying much attention. My ears were tuned to the silence around us. Something about it made me uneasy, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the night by saying I was spooked for no reason. And then we heard it. A noise above us, on the roof of Johan's old trailer. It was loud enough that it cut him off mid-sentence, his eyes darting up. I looked up too, but of course all I could see was the black outline of the trailer against the sky. The noise was steady, deliberate, like heavy footsteps, moving from one end of the trailer to the other. "What the hell was that?" Johan muttered, setting his beer down. I stayed silent, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then resumed, moving back the way they had come. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. Too heavy for any raccoon or opossum. It almost sounded like someone was walking up there. Johan grabbed the flashlight beside him, his fingers tense, his eyes still glued to the trailer. He looked at me, his expression serious. "You hear that?" I nodded. "Yeah, it's not an animal, right?" My stomach twisted as I said it. I could feel my pulse quicken, the tightness in my chest. There shouldn't have been anything up there. We were out in the middle of nowhere, no other people, no cars, no campsites nearby. Johan flicked on the flashlight and stood up. He took a few steps towards the trailer, and I followed, my eyes fixed on the top, waiting for something to move, to see something that would make sense of the sound. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, casting shadows across the trailer, the light bouncing with every step Johan took. We reached the side of the trailer, and Johan aimed the flashlight up, the beam sweeping across the roof. Nothing, just the dull metal reflecting a bit of the firelight and the dark, cloudless sky beyond. "Do you see anything?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky, almost a whisper. Johan shook his head. "Nope, nothing." He stood there for a moment, the light still pointed up. I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow, and I could feel my own heart pounding. I didn't want to say it out loud, but I knew he felt it too, that sense that something was off, that we weren't alone. He moved the flashlight to the back of the trailer, and I followed, stepping carefully, trying to keep quiet. The fire was behind us, casting long shadows, and everything felt darker now. The sound had stopped, but the silence was different now, thicker, heavier, like the whole forest was holding its breath. We got to the back of the trailer, and Johann reached up, grabbing the small ladder that led to the roof. He looked back at me, his eyes wide, and I could see the uncertainty there. "You really want to go up there?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Johann hesitated, then shook his head. He let go of the ladder and turned the flashlight off. "Nah. Probably just something that fell. I don't see anything, and whatever it was, it's gone now." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. It didn't feel right. Something about the sound, about the way it had moved, it felt wrong. But I nodded anyway. "Yeah, you're probably right." We walked back to the fire, trying to act normal, but the tension was still there. Neither of us sat down. We just stood by the fire, staring into the flames, listening. Every rustle of the wind, every crackle of the fire made me jump, my eyes darting around, trying to catch sight of something, anything that would explain the noise. Johann reached down and grabbed his beer, taking a long drink. "Just a raccoon, right?" he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice was tight. He looked at me, and I could tell he didn't believe it either. I forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, probably." But then we heard it again, the same noise, footsteps, slow and heavy, moving across the roof. My heart jumped into my throat, and I felt my whole body tense, every muscle going rigid. I looked at Johann, and he looked at me, his eyes wide, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "It's still up there," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My skin prickled, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Johann didn't say anything. He just turned the flashlight back on, pointing it towards the trailer, his hand shaking. The footsteps continued, moving slowly, deliberately. They didn't sound like an animal. They sounded like a person who wanted us to know they were there. "Who's up there?" Johann shouted, his voice cracking slightly. He took a step towards the trailer, the flashlight beam bouncing. "Hey, who's up there?" The footsteps stopped. Dead silence. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The fire crackled behind us, and I felt the heat on my back, but I was cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones. Johann took another step, his hands trembling. He aimed the flashlight up at the roof again, the light moving across the metal. Still nothing. No movement. No sound. Just silence. I didn't want to be here anymore. Every instinct in me was screaming to leave, to run, to get as far away as possible. I stepped back, my hands clenched into fists. "Johann, we need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." He didn't move. He just stood there, the flashlight pointed at the roof, his eyes wide. "But who the hell is up there?" he whispered almost to himself. "I don't care. We need to go," I said, my voice louder now, the fear pushing me, making me desperate. I reached out, grabbing his arm, pulling him away from the trailer. "Johann, please." He hesitated, then nodded, his eyes still on the roof. He turned off the flashlight, and we backed away, moving towards the fire, towards the safety of the light. I kept my eyes on the trailer, my heart pounding, my legs trembling. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like we were being watched. We reached the fire, and Johann looked at me, his face pale. "We can't just leave our stuff," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't care," I said, my voice sharp. "We can come back in the morning. I don't want to be here anymore." He nodded, and we turned towards the path that led back to the road, to the safety of the car. I could barely see it in the dark, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. We started walking, our footsteps quick, our breath coming in fast, panicked bursts. We hadn't gone more than a few steps when we heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were on the ground, moving towards us, fast. My heart leapt into my throat, and I felt a jolt of pure terror shoot through me. I grabbed Johann's arm, pulling him, and we started running. We didn't look back. We just ran, our feet pounding on the ground, the darkness closing in around us. I could hear the footsteps behind us, following, getting closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The fear pushed me, kept me moving, kept me running. The path twisted and turned, the trees closing in, branches scratching at my arms, my face. I stumbled, almost falling, but Johann caught me, pulling me back up, and we kept going. The footsteps were right behind us now, so close I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was there, didn't want to see who or what was chasing us. We broke through the trees, the car just ahead, the metal gleaming faintly in the moonlight. I fumbled for the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them out of my pocket. Johann was right beside me, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I got the key into the lock, yanked the door open, and practically dove inside. Johann got in beside me, slamming the door shut, and I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I didn't wait. I hit the gas, the tires spinning on the gravel, and we tore away, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I looked in the rearview mirror, my heart pounding, my hands clenched on the wheel. The path behind us was empty. No movement, no footsteps, just darkness, the trees swaying in the wind. Neither of us spoke. The fear was still there, sitting heavy in the car, in the silence between us. I kept my eyes on the road, my breath coming in short, shaky gasps. I didn't slow down until we were miles away, the forest far behind us, the lights of the nearest town just ahead. Only then did I let out a long, shaky breath, my body sagging, the adrenaline draining away. Johann looked at me, his face pale, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely audible. "I don't know." We never went back for our things. Whatever was out there, whatever had followed us, it wasn't worth it. We didn't talk about it after that. We tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the roof of the trailer, following us into the dark. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for us to come back. The time the forest was supposed to be peaceful. I came out here to clear my head, to walk in the quiet, to get away from everything for a while. Work was piling up, stress was through the roof, and I just needed to escape. So I packed up my gear, drove out to this trail I knew, a quiet one, not many people around, tucked away in the hills, and set off into the woods. The trail was old, overgrown in places, but still passable. It twisted through the thick woods, the kind where the trees are so tall they block most of the sky. There was a stillness that I liked, a kind of quiet that let me breathe again. I could hear my own footsteps crunching over the leaves, the distant call of birds, the occasional snap of a twig as a squirrel darted away. It was everything I needed, just me, alone, and the sound of nature. I'd been walking for about an hour, the sun still hanging high above the trees, when I heard it. "Patrick!" the voice called. It was distant, faint, like it was coming from deeper in the woods. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. It wasn't a scream or anything, just my name, spoken calmly, almost like a conversation. But it was out of place. No one knew I was out here. I turned, looking around, trying to pinpoint where it had come from, but all I could see were trees, dense and unmoving. Maybe I imagined it, I thought. Maybe it was the wind. I shook my head, trying to brush it off, But there it was again. Patrick. It was closer this time. My name, clear as day, drifting through the woods. There was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, and they knew my name. I felt a chill run down my spine, a tightness in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Who's there?" No answer, just silence. The wind rustled the leaves, the trees swayed gently, but nothing else moved. I stood there, straining my ears, waiting for something, anything. My name again. A footstep. Laughter. But there was nothing. I swallowed, my throat dry. I didn't like this. I didn't like it one bit. I could feel my skin prickling, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Something about this felt wrong. The woods were empty. I was sure of it. There hadn't been a car at the trailhead, and I hadn't seen a soul since I got here. I turned back towards the trail, picking up my pace. The crunch of my footsteps felt too loud, echoing in the silence. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the trees, looking for movement. But there was nothing. Just the woods, deep and dark, the shadows stretching longer as the sun began to dip lower. After a few minutes, I heard it again. Patrick. This time it came from my right, deeper in the woods, off the trail. I stopped again, my heart pounding now, my stomach twisting in knots. The voice was wrong. There was something off about it. It sounded like my name, but there was a distortion, a kind of echo, like it was coming from something that wasn't supposed to be there. "Who are you?" I shouted, trying to sound brave, but my voice trembled. No answer. I turned, staring into the woods, the dense underbrush, the thick trees. My heart was racing, my breath coming quick. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it. I felt eyes on me, felt like I was being watched. A branch snapped, and I flinched, my head whipping around. Nothing, just shadows. The sun was sinking lower, the light fading, and everything was starting to blend together. I needed to move. I needed to get out of here. I started walking again, faster now, almost jogging. My backpack thumped against my shoulders, my breathing loud in my ears. I just needed to get back to the car. I kept telling myself that. I just needed to get back, and everything would be fine. But the voice came again. Patrick. It was closer now, almost directly behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, my eyes wide. Nothing, no one, just the trees, the empty trail, the fading light. My hands were shaking. I could feel the panic starting to set in, my body going cold, my skin prickling. I couldn't understand it. How could someone be calling my name without me seeing them? How could they know where I was? I started to run. I didn't care if I looked ridiculous, running through the woods like some scared kid. I just wanted out. I just wanted to be back in my car on the road, away from whatever was out here. My feet pounded on the dirt, the branches whipping at my arms, the wind rushing past me. Patrick! The voice was right in my ear now, like someone was standing inches from me. I let out a yelp, stumbling, almost losing my footing. I caught myself, my heart racing, and kept running. I could feel tears welling up in my eyes, my vision blurring. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my chest tight. The trail twisted, winding through the trees, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching, my lungs burning. I could hear the voice still calling my name, echoing through the woods, coming from every direction. It was like it was inside my head, like it was crawling under my skin. Patrick, Patrick, Patrick. I couldn't take it. I stumbled to a stop, my body shaking, tears streaming down my face. I spun around, screaming, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" Silence. The woods were still, the trees swaying gently in the wind. The voice was gone. I stood there panting, my body trembling, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I felt like I was going to be sick. The world seemed to tilt around me, the shadows deepening, the sky turning dark. I needed to move. I needed to get out of here. I turned back towards the trail, my legs weak, my steps unsteady. The sun was almost gone now, the last light fading, and the woods were growing darker by the second. I could barely see the path in front of me, and I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers shaking. I flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, and started walking again, every step feeling like it took all the strength I had left. The voice was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could feel it, that presence, just beyond the edge of the light, just out of sight. The trail seemed longer now, like it was stretching on forever, twisting through the woods, leading me deeper instead of out. I kept moving, my eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, making the branches sway, and every sound made my heart skip a beat. I thought I saw something, movement, just at the edge of the light. I swung the flashlight around, the beam bouncing, my hands trembling. Nothing, just trees, just shadows. But I knew it was there. I knew something was there, watching me, following me. I kept walking, my steps quick, the flashlight beam shaking. I could see the darkness closing in, the woods pressing around me, the path barely visible now. My breath came in short gasps, my chest tight, my body tense. And then I heard it again. Patrick. This time, it was right in front of me. I froze, the flashlight beam flickering, my breath catching in my throat. I stared ahead, the light barely reaching the trees, and I saw it. A shape, a figure, standing just beyond the beam, tall and dark, almost blending into the shadows. My heart stopped. My whole body went cold. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its face hidden in the darkness. I took a step back, my legs trembling, my breath coming in shaky gasps. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I felt rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the figure, my mind screaming at me to move, to do something. And then, slowly, it started to move towards me. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't think. I just ran, my feet pounding on the trail, my body moving on instinct. The flashlight bounced in my hand, the beam flickering, the shadows rushing past me. I could hear it behind me, the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, keeping pace with me, getting closer. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, tears streaming down my face. The trail twisted, turned, and I could barely see, the darkness closing in, the trees blurring. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I went down hard, the flashlight flying out of my hand, the beam cutting out as it hit the ground. I scrambled up, my hands clawing at the dirt, my body shaking, and I grabbed the flashlight, flicking it back on. The beam cut through the darkness, and I swung it around, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. The path was empty. The woods were silent. The figure was gone. I didn't wait. I pushed myself up, my body trembling, and started running again, my legs weak, my steps uneven. I could see the faint glow of the trailhead ahead, the last light of the setting sun, just barely visible through the trees. I burst out of the woods, my feet hitting the gravel of the parking lot, and I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. I yanked the door open, practically falling inside, and slammed it shut behind me, locking the doors. I sat there, panting, my heart pounding, my whole body shaking. I looked back at the trail, the darkness deep and impenetrable, the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing moved. Nothing followed me out. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and I peeled out of the parking lot, the tires skidding on the gravel. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if there was anything standing there, watching me leave. I drove for miles, my hands clenched on the wheel, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I could still hear it, the voice, my name echoing in my ears, crawling under my skin. I don't know who it was. I don't know what it was. But I know it was there, and it knew me. I haven't been back to that trail. I won't go back. Whatever was out there, whatever knew my name, it wasn't something I want to see again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I can still hear it. My name drifting through the darkness, like it's calling me back. And I'm terrified that one day I might answer. I found the camp at 4,500 meters on Chimborazo. Everything laid out with impossible precision. I've been a mountain guide for 15 years. I've seen hundreds of camps. But this one was wrong. The geometry was wrong. The timing was wrong. Everything was wrong. I was doing a solo recon for next week's climb. Standard procedure, check routes, assess conditions, mark hazards. The weather was clear. Temperature 5 degrees Celsius. Wind 15 km/h from the southwest. Normal conditions for that altitude. The camp appeared at 1300 hours. 4 tents, modern equipment, top brands, set in a perfect square. I measured the distances, exactly 5 meters between each tent. Perfect right angles, impossible precision at that altitude. The gear layout caught my eye first. Climbing equipment arranged in patterns, not normal patterns, mathematical ones. Ice axes formed perfect radial arrays. Carabiners arranged in Fibonacci sequences. Ropes coiled in golden spirals. I checked my GPS. The camp sat on a 45-degree slope. But the ground under the tents was level, perfectly level. I measured it. The bubble in my level didn't move. That's not possible. The mountain doesn't have flat spots at that altitude. The temperature around the camp read 15 degrees, 10 degrees colder than the surrounding area. No wind inside the square formed by the tents. Complete stillness. The air felt thick, dense, like breathing liquid nitrogen. I documented everything. Standard procedure. The photos showed more than I saw. The patterns in the gear arrangements cast shadows that didn't match the sun angle. The tents cast no shadows at all. Movement caught my eye at 13:15 hours. Something on the ridge above camp. Hard to see against the snow. A figure in climbing gear. Modern alpine equipment. But wrong. The proportions were wrong. Too tall. Too thin. The movements too precise. I took more photos. The figure remained still. Exactly still. No movement. Not even micro-adjustments that all living things make. Complete stillness. I measured the height using my rangefinder. 3 meters tall. Standing on a 70-degree slope like it was flat ground. The camp's organization kept changing. Every time I looked away, the patterns shifted. New mathematical arrangements, new geometric progressions, but everything stayed perfect. Too perfect. Inhumanly precise. I checked inside the first tent at 13:30 hours. Sleeping bag laid out with geometric precision, every wrinkle exactly measured, every fold following mathematical rules. The bag was cold, colder than the surrounding air. My thermometer read 25 degrees Celsius just above the fabric. Personal items lined the tent walls, modern clothes, high-end gear, arranged in patterns that hurt my eyes. The geometry wasn't right, wasn't natural. Angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The figure on the ridge moved. No transition, just different position, like a video skipping frames. Now closer to camp. Still wrong, still too tall, too precise. The climbing gear it wore didn't move naturally, didn't respond to gravity or wind. My electronic equipment failed at 13:45 hours. GPS died, radio died, phone died. Even my digital watch stopped. The mechanical compass spun, not randomly, in mathematical patterns, perfect circles divided into exact segments. The air temperature dropped again. 20 degrees Celsius around the camp perimeter. The stillness intensified. Sound didn't travel right. My footsteps echoed with mathematical precision, each crunch of snow repeated at exact intervals. I checked the second tent. More patterns, different mathematical rules, climbing ropes woven into geometric shapes that shouldn't exist, knots that looped through extra dimensions, equipment arranged in sequences that made my brain hurt. The figure moved again, instant position change, closer. Now I could see details. The climbing gear was wrong, too symmetric, too precise. The fabric didn't wrinkle naturally. The metal didn't reflect light correctly. Everything followed mathematical rules instead of physical ones. Third tent, at 1400 hours. Food supplies arranged in fractal patterns. Geometric progressions in the placement of every item. Perfect mathematical spacing. The temperature inside read 30 degrees C. The food showed no sign of freezing. The figure reached the camp edge, 3 meters tall. Climbing gear fitted to impossible proportions, no face visible behind the modern goggles and face protection. Just smooth blankness, wrong angles, wrong geometry. It moved through the camp, each step precisely measured. No impact in the snow, no response to the slope angle. Perfect vertical position maintained regardless of terrain. The patterns in the camp shifted to match its movements. The fourth tent contained electronics, modern GPS units, satellite phones, laptops, all arranged in mathematical patterns, all dead. The screens showed geometric sequences, binary code that followed impossible rules. The figure stood at the camp center at 14:15 hours, perfect stillness. The cold radiated from it in geometric patterns. I measured the temperature gradient, exact 10-degree drops at precise intervals. The air crystallized in mathematical fractals. The camp patterns shifted faster. Equipment flowed like liquid, formed new geometric shapes, new mathematical progressions. The tents rippled. The fabric moved in ways that violated physics. Everything realigned to new rules. The figure turned toward me. No natural motion, just instantaneous reorientation. The climbing gear it wore flickered, showed something underneath, something geometric, something built from mathematical laws instead of matter. The cold hit, 40 degrees C. The air turned solid, formed crystal lattices that followed perfect mathematical rules. Sound became geometry, light became equations. Reality stretched around non-Euclidean principles. I ran, basic survival instinct, primitive brain overriding curiosity. The figure didn't follow, didn't need to. The mathematical patterns spread out from the camp, changed the terrain, changed physics, changed reality. My equipment revived at 1,500 meters distance. Everything normal, everything working. But the data was corrupted, not randomly, corrupted into mathematical patterns, perfect geometric progressions in the digital noise. I reported an abandoned camp, couldn't tell them the truth. The rescue team found nothing, no tents, no equipment, no evidence. But the snow showed patterns, geometric shapes, mathematical rules written in crystal structure. They installed monitors, temperature sensors, motion detectors. Everything died within the first hour. The readings showed impossible data, geometric progressions, mathematical sequences beyond human understanding. The patterns spread. Each snowfall shows new geometry, new mathematics. The crystals form impossible shapes, follow impossible rules. Reality bends around equations we can't comprehend. The figure still appears, always at 14:15 hours, always 3 meters tall, always wearing modern climbing gear that doesn't move right, doesn't follow physics, just mathematics. Other climbers report it now. Perfect geometric camps that appear and disappear. Equipment arranged in impossible patterns. A too-tall figure in wrong-moving climbing gear, always watching, always measuring, always calculating. The mountain is changing. The snow crystals show new geometry. The ice forms mathematical patterns. Reality follows new rules. Rules written in equations instead of physics. Rules left by something that looks human but thinks in pure mathematics. I still guide on Chimborazo. Have to. It's my life. But I watch the snow patterns, study the crystal structures, monitor the geometric progressions, and sometimes at 14-15 hours, I see it. 3 meters tall, wearing gear that doesn't move right, standing impossibly still, watching us with eyes that see only mathematics, rewriting our world in equations we were never meant to solve.